Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to the Dice Ball podcast, covering everything that you've ever wanted to know about how to run and play in the Genesis role-playing game by Fantasy Flight Games. I'm your host, GM Hurley, and this episode we have a very interesting show for you, but for the moment I'd like to introduce you to the people who made this GM cry after the final session of Dragon Squadron, probably the most likely the most epic Star Wars game that I have ever run or been involved in. My co-hosts, GMs Huz, Flano and Caitlin. How are we all this evening? A little bit somber?
Oh, yeah, I've been in a funk, since that episode, that game, sorry.
I've been feeling fantastic since that episode. I don't know what everyone else is going on about.
My character cleared his obligation, so he's happy.
My character killed Darth Vader, so...
That is true. Anyway, yeah, somebody asked us for more information about Dragon Squadron on the forum, so on Facebook. So
we do have a little bit coming up where we talk about what we've been up to this week. I think that's a pretty key thing that we've been doing.
So, Michael, what have you been up to this week?
Besides assisting in the murder of Darth Vader, I've been playing Star Wars RPG, obviously. Done a little bit of Stars of Outnumber a week or so ago. Played the Sprawl, which is an APOC system hack, and that was really, really fun. Really grungy cyberpunk roleplay, completely not Genesis whatsoever, but it's still nonetheless a very narrative storytelling RPG, which is great. I was in a Infinity tournament as of this recording yesterday, came third, so I'm pretty happy. I haven't played that game competitively in about 2 years, so a bit of a high, a bit of a buzz from that, so it's been a pretty good...
Yeah.
A fair few good gaming moments recently, which is good. Congratulations,
you. Martin, what have you been up to?
To be honest, I haven't been up to much apart from playing in the Star Wars game with you guys. Dragon Squadron, shedding a tear here. Other than that, I've played in the Pathfinder game that I'm a part of, which is going great. We've
almost finished that one combat.
Yeah, when combat happens, it takes a long time, but we try to avoid that. But
the barn is still smouldering at this point. They haven't left the barn yet.
I was 25 when he started that fight, and now I'm 30, so...
Hey. But yeah, apart from that, I haven't really been up to much.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that's a bit sad, but I mean, you were there for Star Wars, and that's all that counts.
Pathfinder's not that sad, buddy. Come on.
Did I just show my true colours? I apologise.
Well, to be fair, Pathfinder's great. Within reason, Martin. Within reason.
Hey, just because, we're level 22. And
Good Lord.
One of the best campaigns I've played. Not because I don't want to sound like we're bashing a Pathfinder, because one of the best campaigns...
No, this is a great campaign.
Yes, that's exactly it.
I'm loving it.
One of the best campaigns I've been in up to this date was a Pathfinder campaign, so I can't rag on it too much. So my early RPG memories was with Pathfinder. So
very good. Yeah. Caitlin.
Well, yeah, I've pretty much been involved in the Stars Without Number campaign, which we had, which was another really intensive role-playing session that we had. And I think we're going to change it to Meetings Without Number now rather than Stars Without Number, because it was just, it's just so interesting. We get around the table, and because, as you know, our characters are so new, we just have, I'm going to have an interaction with this person, I'm going to have a meeting with this person, and it's all because we're all having this time in between traveling. So yeah, it was another rpretty role-play intensive session, but we managed to come to an agreement as a crew on how we're going to progress with the story from there in terms of working together, because at the moment there's a few little subplots a brewing. Yeah, just
so
a scotch.
many liabilities.
Yeah, I know you can't see, but I've just given a bit of a sideways stare at Martin because it's his character that my character's a little bit uneasy about.
Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me.
Incredibly so. And then the other part is Dragon Squadron, and I think we should probably have a little bit of a moment to talk about what Dragon Squadron is and why it's so amazing, and that it has naturally, in the most truest sense of that word, come to an end.
probably one of the most epic campaigns that I've ever run. As I said before, we started by doing a playtest for a module that's been well and truly been released. It sort of came from this small thing that we thought was just going to be a one-off thing to this hugely epic storytelling with some very dramatic moments all the way through that told a great story from the perspective of 6 characters. So.
It spanned many players as well.
Exactly. So
because I was only new to that campaign.
Yeah, true.
My character started when Mike's character had to recreate a character after his character committed righteous suicide in my very first game, and it was actually Dragon Squadron. Like I played when I very first started, doing tabletop role playing games. I had played a few different things. Like I had done D&D. I had played the Star Wars numerical version of the role playing game, and I had just done maybe like 2 sessions of Star Wars RPG with the Fantasy Flight narrative dice system. But it wasn't until being introduced to Ian and actually sitting around the Dragon Squadron table that I did. Like I loved the narrative dice when I played it, but this was the first like serious campaign that I had played and serious character, and I would actually quite easily say that this was the game that got me completely and well and truly hooked into this narrative dice system.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think your character and my character on the very first session we were together at, because we both introduced our characters. I had a character previously, but he had died at one point. He killed himself to slow down an Inquisitor, essentially, and somewhat worked.
With a thermal detonator.
No. He shot a fusion lead he was carrying.
I always thought it was a thermal detonator. That's why we had to run so quickly.
It goes off very similar to a thermal detonator. It's a thermal lantern exploding, so it's a big explosion. But it killed him in the process. But I remember the first session that Vixto and Von were at. So
Vixto was my character, and Von's was GM Hunt.
That's right. And it's interesting because GM Caitlin and I's character sort of formed a bit of a duo, good cop, bad cop, throughout the entire campaign. Yep. And it was formulated in that first session because you had one of the slaver ships, which had a big hook hanging off the end of it, picking things up. And my character was hanging off the back of that hook, shooting his sniper rifle at a close combat where Slane, which was Harris's character, was fighting an Inquisitor. So it was a big epic fight with lots of stuff going on.
Yeah, lots of piloting checks that turned out very nicely in my favor, I will say. But as well, with the Dragon Squadron, it was a campaign that was based for a group of pilots essentially going up against the Empire at the same time. That I think it was just before the Battle of Endor, is where a lot of the history, in the time space of the Star Wars lore was taking place. So it's just it was really interesting. We started off being I started off in the session or in the campaign thinking that we were going to be these rebels and these amazing people fighting against the Empire, and then it just turned into this bit of a ragtag group of people that are like doing the right thing but not exactly have a past that would lead them towards that. And it was just really cool to kind of see that grow and the characters grow and all the connections. Yep. Like we had a birthday for Von. We had Aiden's character, who is GM Flanos. He got a pet for his birthday. Like
he was great.
He was amazing.
Wasn't it?
It was. Even though my character had no survival, I still tried to play with it and look after it and keep it alive, even though it did bite me a lot. I took a couple of wounds from that Nexu, and I have no problems with that. None whatsoever.
What happened to it?
The last
No, he took it with him.
Yeah, because I saved him from there was an encounter where we stormed a ship effectively with our ship, and that's where you got the E-web.
You have to be more descriptive. Which ship did we storm?
This is a lot. This is the thing.
There were a few.
It was the one that we didn't do a boarding action. It was the one that we did a boarding action with our own ship into the cargo bay.
It was a Star Destroyer, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Because that was also where one of the other characters, Trax, who's played by Caleb, he managed to do a very convincing persuasion check to get another stormtrooper to wave back at him as he was waving on his way in.
It was an E-web gunner.
That's
and
correct.
There was enough time for Von to sprint across and then knock out the E-Web gunner who was waving back at tracks.
Yeah.
Because he was that charming. And Von clocked him in the head, and from that point forward, because Von had Brawn 5, so he could wield an E-Web proficiently and turn that against everyone.
It was my job after effectively going through and landing the ship within the Star Destroyer, and you were already out fighting, and because Vixto was she was not a fighter. She had one of my favorite skills of hers was don't shoot for that particular reason. So I remember grabbing the Nexu and grabbing a whole bunch of other things and just trying to run across to get to another ship that we could take out. It was amazing.
He's
alive. He's alive.
He's
I
around.
made sure of it.
He's just
somewhere. He's back on the fire side? He would be back on the fire side, wouldn't he?
Now, the fire side for the listeners at home would be the Nebulon B that you guys stole. Would that be right?
No, we didn't steal it. It was assigned to us by the rebellion.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
It was too. I think that was a duty reward.
That was a duty reward. That was a very tasty one
to give an idea,
too.
we had 1,000 XP each. And I was a bounty hunter. No, I was a Mandalorian with 4 specialization trees.
Yeah.
So
Good lord.
I was a Koshi with 4. I was a martial artist, operator. What was my 4th? I don't even remember.
this was just last week, man.
I know, it was something. Yeah, we did a lot of things.
You actually said last episode that we should put up all the characters, and I think we need to do that.
Well, now the campaign's wrapped up. And
exactly.
Now our characters in their final form. It's actually, how much XP did we get from that final session?
I think it was probably about...
You said 100.
I did say 100.
Bond's going to get a ding.
My character was a Zeltron pilot, effectively, but also got a lot of trees and charmer and gambler.
And ended up being a cyborg at the end.
Indeed. That was actually another one of my most favourite moments. It was just something that kind of happened when I rolled a despair, as well as Von rolling a despair and shot me on the stomach. And it was like the first point of I think I only had 1 point of hate left.
Von was mind control. He deliberately shot you.
Yeah, sorry, he did. He did. Sorry, that's right. Well, mind controlled to deliberately shoot me. He didn't deliberately shoot me because, I said something. Yeah. But yeah, it just so happened it was the one time that I managed to get shot in the whole session. It happened to be by another player character and happened to also take out all of my hit points. And I rolled a despair after that. And when my character looked down at her stomach, it was all these wires shooting out and. Yeah, had no idea, and then the rest of the session was trying to figure out who am I. It was awesome. It was really cool.
Now, this is where I think I can reveal, now that it's at the end, that this is, as we all look behind the curtain, that's probably a good example of a GM being thrown with a dice roll that they don't actually know what to do with. So I've just gone, what's the coolest thing that comes into my brain? That you're a cyborg. There you go. And that's where it sort of stemmed from. And that had massive ramifications down the track.
Oh, the whole thing.
That I've just run with it. So,
it was cool.
That's something that I think, so that, we also get a little bit of gaming knowledge out there for people, is that what they can do is obviously if, you come across something that you think would be cool, but you don't know how to introduce it, just introduce it and deal with the consequences later on.
I think the important thing to note there as well is that there was a bit of an agreement between you and the players that it was okay to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's, there is that certain level of buy-in. So, and I think that, that's obviously...
How did you do that noise with your mouth? That was so impressive.
Oh, a man of many talents.
I didn't think you could go that high-pitched.
Wow.
Because it wasn't because someone forgot to turn their phone on silent.
Not at all. No.
That was your sound effect. That's your happy noise.
All my friends are sitting at the table anyway. It's like, who's messaging me?
Aww, that's beautiful.
Anyway. But I would say that, as I said before, I think the Dragon Squadron was probably my most favourite campaign that I've ever run and played in, and I think that has so much to do with the type of players that were at the table. And I think that makes a big difference as to how good a campaign can go, because the GM just sort of, especially in this system, just sort of points the players in the right direction, and the rest of it just all sort of comes about through good role play and through the players agreeing to a course of conduct effectively. And I think that that was set up right from the start.
Absolutely. And now that we have killed Darth Vader,
Yeah, we did.
I'm looking forward to the adventures now that come from
All
that.
right. Should we pause it right there and
I think we
describe
should.
how the events of Darth Vader? Because it's one thing to say we killed Darth Vader. I think a lot of players are going to go,
We
killed Darth Vader.
do have a
But-
core of the show to get to.
But, well, brief summary. We're in a tower in a a Cloud City type.
It's a Cloud City
Cloud
type,
essentially.
yeah.
Not Cloud City, but same sort of thing. We're in a tower of a big blown out window on one side. There's Von, Aiden, and Slain, the three meatheads of the party, I guess you can
basically
say.
shoulder to shoulder.
Shoulder to shoulder.
Yep.
Vader rocks up. We're fighting Vader. Slane's the first one to go down. He gets
fighting
crippled.
Vader and his stormtrooper
Yeah, because there's a whole
Yes.
awful lot of stormtroopers.
Honestly, we just ignored those stormtroopers. Like, they were just like, oh, whatever.
They shot me so many times.
There was like 6 of them. I had 2 minion groups of 6, and I've never actually thrown 6 6 stormtroopers in a mini group. I've never had that, so why
And
the
you
hell
missed
not?
everyone else but me, hitting you for 16 damage twice.
It's
yes.
pretty,
It was awesome.
But yes, back to the scene. Slain got crippled, so he couldn't do any actions for the rest of the combat, which is brutal for a Jedi.
Slain is the Jedi.
Yeah, so he's
Yeah.
like, he's the guy to fight Vader because he has the lightsaber. The rest
And
of
he,
us do not.
and he also has a backstory and a history with Vader as well, which was a key thing. Like, this was his moment.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
he's an ex-Inquisitor.
Correct.
And because we were expecting Vader's going to kill us all, and then Ian said he hasn't got plot armor, so let the dice land how they land.
Yep.
But even then, it's a tough fight. Slain gets crippled. Aiden kicks him out of the building essentially because luckily Slain had a grav chute, so he could fall to safety.
Because he was being force choked by Vader.
No, he was crushed to the ground. His sternum crushed by Vader's force push.
It was that and something. Oh, but anyway,
Yeah.
and so I kick him out of the way so that Vader's
There
no
was a
longer,
lot happening.
Yes.
Vader's no longer got the pressure on him from the force.
However, to buy the time required for Slain to get Aiden out, Von used he had maglock gloves, and I flipped a story point to say the maglock gloves happened to work on the material that the Slane's lightsaber was made out of. So his lightsaber drew to Von's hand, and Von's never used a lightsaber in his life.
No.
But he's got 5 brawn, so he's rolling 5 green dice, and a lot of you would have seen the roll on our Facebook page. That was that desperate roll against Vader, which was 3 or 4 reds. I can't remember anymore.
There were 3
it was-
reds.
3 reds
Three.
and 3 blacks. That was my challenge. I'm like, all right, fair enough. Missed, but did get 3 advantages. It was enough time to distract Vader and draw Vader's attention to Von. Slain got kicked out of the building by Aiden. Unfortunately, Vader was pretty sick of Von being annoying, so stabbed Von through the chest with the lightsaber.
Rolled a crit.
Got a crit of 149, which was on the brink. Luckily, though, Von has like 25 wounds, so he wasn't actually unconscious, which means on the brink doesn't put you unconscious.
No.
It just makes you're going to die in the end of the next round.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, Von's got 1 turn to live. What can I do with this? Vader, thinking he had slain Von, spun around and tacked Aiden and cut your helmet in one big arc and blinded you, correct?
Well, it was 2 things, because I responded by drawing my own lightsaber.
That's right.
'Cause I have a collection.
Mandalorian of lightsabers everywhere.
Carrying his blade.
Yep.
But this is Vader.
It's Vader.
He basically just pushed my blade out of the way and struck me,
Yep.
and then cut my helmet in half
Yep.
with my face along with it. I'm now blind.
Blind,
Yes.
yep. And
Yes.
this point in time, before the combat started, because Tam, which was Caleb's character, or Trax, he had sort of 2 names, and Vixto, Caitlin's character, they went off to try and find a ship, and Vader's shuttle was nearby, and they managed to acquire Vader's shuttle. And Ian, GM Hurley, he determined the shuttle will arrive in 2 rounds. So this wasn't scripted at all, and it just so happened that the shuttle was arriving on the same turn that Von was going to die. So I screamed out, my character screamed out, shoot, 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 and he tried to wrestle Vader. Because at this point, Slain, you bugged out with your jetpack.
Well,
blindly.
I was on
Slain, Aiden,
one.
sorry.
I was on 1 hit
That's
point,
right.
1 wound left.
Yes, that's it.
So like,
wasn't
I
going
was
well.
on
It
my
wasn't going
threshold,
well. No.
but I've got a backpack,
Yep.
so I just sort of fell
Jetpack.
backwards.
You got a jetpack.
Sorry, yeah, a jetpack.
That's a very important thing to stipulate.
And so I just fall backwards out the
Yep.
window.
It's like Dora the Explorer. I got a backpack. I can survive a fall from a cloud city.
And and go join Slain.
Yes.
So they're out of the way for the shot.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I just want to point out at this point, I used the Darth Vader stats that appear in Dawn of Rebellion. Okay,
Yeah.
because I
So
thought
Sanctioned Vader.
Sanctioned Vader.
Sanctioned Vader.
Okay, I think I gave him a couple of extra defense dice.
Yeah.
You don't up against.
Yeah, because I mean I'm going up against 5,000 XP players, so I've upped him a little bit. And I think I gave him Cortosis armor because it doesn't actually have Cortosis
He should
armor.
have Cortosis.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, so
I had Cortosis.
So anyway, so I've upped it a little bit.
So yeah,
But the thing was is that
Beskar
he had 19 strain and 26 wounds, something like that. He took no wounds up until a certain point. He took no wounds whatsoever. He took a little bit of strain because he was parrying and
parrying
whatever
with
else.
flamethrower.
Yeah, exactly right. But anyway, that's a side note. But yeah, so no wounds. So he thought he was
doing well.
he was the bee's knees.
we were
He
doing
was good.
we were doing poorly. I think that's a good word.
He was destroying us.
But at that point, Von, nothing to lose, wrestled Vader, and again didn't because Von's aim was to grab Vader in a bit of an arm lock and pull him to his chest and hold him long enough for the shuttle, which was ascending to the blown out window, just to fire blindly into the room and just wipe out Vader and Von with it because.
He was gonna die.
Well, it was originally because I was going to be gunnery. I was just going to try and take out the stormtroopers, cause a distraction so that we could get everyone out safely.
Wasn't going to happen.
Didn't
Yeah,
happen.
it was
happen.
Vader's shuttle. I should
was
point
Vader's
that out.
shuttle.
as well.
We pointed that out. And anyway, so the grapple did fail ultimately, but it did roll enough advantages. It was 4 or 5 advantages or something like that. And I had Vader's arm get stuck between Von's forearm and bicep, and he sort of slid his arm down and disarmed Vader.
Disarmed him. Yeah.
Which is great because Vader can't block much when he hasn't got his lightsaber.
No.
No reflect for you,
No
buddy.
reflect, except for maybe he can, we've always seen Empire Strikes Back. He deflects Han's blaster.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I always thought
But-
that was protect.
Protect more than deflect.
Yeah.
However, the shuttle did rise, and the shuttle has a linked laser cannon. And Caitlin,
So my character was in the gunnery seat this time, and Tam was in the piloting
Right,
seat. So he was making sure it was staying steady.
Tam gave Vader a little wave.
Yeah,
He did give Vader a wave, but pretty much I've
Just to paint a picture here, Tam is a Toydarian.
Oh, yeah.
So just to give you an idea what Tam is, because if he's a human waving at Vader, okay, well when it's a Toydarian waving at Vader,
So
which is ironic
sarcastic.
considering who Vader
Yes.
was and what I was his master. So it's kind of anyway.
He's a Jedi. What do you know?
Triggered. So Vixto arrives and she's taking in the scene and everything else that can be seen. She was expecting to see like Slain and everyone else in there, but she just sees Von.
Saw Slain falling.
Yeah, as we're going up, what was that? Is that something
There's
just falling
another.
down? There's another one. Oh god, they must be doing well. And as it goes, so I see Vader, I see Von, who's got this like smoldering hole in his chest, effectively from this lightsaber, and I do a gunnery check to roll, and I do have some pretty special talents being
Reroll,
who Vixto
change,
is.
do
I
everything you want.
can
Yeah.
reroll, and I also have unmatched fortune, which allows me to flip a story point and move dice to its adjacent side.
Yeah.
So as a result, I'm like, well, I'm going to try and get as many triumphs as I can here. Like, this is the situation where you want your triumphs,
Yeah.
you want your epic story
And
moments.
advantage exactly with that link as
And
well.
it
Yeah.
was double or nothing.
And
Yeah.
I
Double or nothing.
did do double or nothing as well.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that Von was also screaming out to shoot.
To
at
shoot,
this
Yes.
point.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and smiling as well, I should say.
And you were crying.
I was crying.
It's worth, for a mental image of people at home, Von is bigger than Vader.
Everyone just needed to be here in this
Exactly.
moment, right? We're doing our best we can, but we're still on a high from it. So yeah, and I do double or nothing. I have this huge roll, and I try and like everyone just calm down. Everyone's crowding around me at the table. Like, what do you do? And I wanted to get as many triumphs as I can because I thought if I can try and at least get people out to safety, Vader can be incapacitated or something like that.
Yep.
And I get 2 triumphs and I have linked and I can do some pretty decent amount of damage. But then I didn't want to take away Von's amazing death that who would not want to die in the same way that Von
Yeah.
wanted to
Death
die.
was inescapable anyway because I was dead into that round due to
Exactly.
the critical effect.
Exactly. And then on top of that, everyone else had already gotten out of the room. And so, looking at it, I asked the question of, well, as you statted, would I actually kill Vader with this roll? And even with all that, it was. And so I had to try and think, do I do the... We're all talking about it because there was a lot of discussion because there was everyone around telling me what you could do and all that kind of stuff. And in the end, I just kind of thought, well, hey, this is Vixto. She is a character that is incredibly headstrong. She is incredibly she's the person that reacts first and thinks later, in whatever that could be beneficial or detrimental to her. And she's just seen. And so Von, as we mentioned before, was those two characters started out at the same time, and Von took on that kind of father figure role for her. So she's just seen effectively her father figure stabbed in the chest by a guy that she doesn't actually know that much about, like, because Darth Vader is something that's associated with slain. It's not something. Yeah. She's been out on the outer rim this whole time. He's nothing to her. He's scary to her because she failed her fear check and was quite terrified. But seeing that happen, so I just made that decision that no, if that was Vixto and she actually saw that, she'd be going in for the kill. And particularly with the smile from Von saying "do it," she would have done it.
Because we also have to remember as well that whole facility was actually a laboratory where your characters' doppelgangers were being created, plus the original Vixto, who was somebody who is obviously sort of like dying, or she has some sort of disease or whatever, that by this stage she's actually
bit of a husk.
Of a husk, and she's kind of downloaded herself
to me,
to you.
And pretty much the whole thing of why I was an android this whole time was basically she uploaded her mind to all the different versions of Vixto she had around the galaxy to experience life, because she'd never be able to, and that was what her father did. So having all that information for her, there's no doubt that she'd probably be a little bit temperamental and a little bit overwhelmed with the onslaught of information she had. Yeah.
180 points of damage is a little bit more than temperamental.
Hey, girls can have their their angry moments too. We might overreact.
The 180 that GM Flano references is the total damage that the Starship scale weapon did to Vader. It did 18 Starship scale damage because it did have a link, so link activated and made 2 shots for a total of 18 Starship scale, which turned into 180 personal scale.
And as much as Rebels would like us to believe that, I mean, yes, he didn't have his lightsaber at the time anyway, but as much as Rebels would like us to believe that the characters can deflect blaster bolts from ships, that's not how the rules work.
But even if you apply the rule that some people do that says that you can reflect
before conversion,
true, he'd still be dead.
Yes.
It's probably one of my most proudest roles I've ever done.
Yes.
But this is what we said, if you stat it, it will bleed kind of thing. So, we had that. And now we have a really cool sandbox where we go, well, what happens? What does the universe look like now that Vader is dead?
Because there's lots of factors to put into consideration, because no more Luke would have been either killed by the Emperor or persuaded to join the dark side with the Emperor, because there's no Vader there to throw the Emperor into the second Death Star pit, and all the events that happened on Endor would be completely different, because the Emperor would have no need to lure the whole rebellion into some clever ploy. He would just be firing that Death Star super laser as soon as that fleet showed up. It would be a completely different story, and not for the good. I think killing Vader at that point would have so many ramifications that the story, the happy ending that Return of the Jedi is, wouldn't be a happy ending whatsoever. The Emperor would still be in ultimate control, if not more, because now he has a fresh new Anakin equivalent by his side, who's much more mutable than Anakin was.
I think there should be another campaign now in that world. Putting it out there. I want to keep playing.
Yes,
and it was part of what I really liked about that is that we had talked about, what does a Dragon Squadron ending look like? And it was something that we were, had in just discussion about what that could possibly be and when that would happen. But this was something that happened organically and natural and just felt right for all the characters that this would be the last. But this is the thing. It's not the last episode, because we still have to have another campaign to go, where are they now and what's happening?
Yeah, exactly.
So whilst this is, we've all agreed that, no, this is how Dragon Squadron should end and we're marking it as the ending, it's almost like having that little bit at the end where you go, well, what's happening now? And all the players can have their resolution where they need to, almost like as if you were having a session 0, but at the end of the session.
Yeah.
I'm excited for that. I'm really keen for that.
Bonds
that
is
thing.
really easy to wrap up.
in a bow, as we I think, and just because I think I'm hilarious. Thank you.
Yes, exactly.
As emphasis to my
That's
point.
right.
Thank you, GM Hooley. I wrote a narrative story about Vixo's perspective of how that final moment
Yep.
of seeing Von's death and killing the Man in Black, because she doesn't know who Vader is, so it's all called Man in Black throughout the whole thing. And I've titled it Von Voyage.
It is the best. As a pun appreciator, I had a little tear. That was good. It was a very well written piece that sort of was a good finale to a big story arc, and I think it was quite fitting.
Would people be interested in reading that? I think they would.
Perhaps.
I
Maybe
think
after
that'd
the
be kind of
episode,
cool.
if people let us know on Facebook, if you're keen, then we can upload it with some
I think that'd be
editing.
cool. Absolutely. You know what we should probably do? Get on with the show.
We've been well and truly sidetracked.
We have an episode, don't we?
We do.
Is that what we? Oh, I thought we
right.
were just going to talk about this the whole time. Okay,
Okay, yep.
we should probably get into that.
Because we probably need to talk about what we've seen on the internet.
Yeah, don't you mean on the radar?
Yes, I do. On the radar. Welcome to On the Radar, the segment where we will discuss the latest and greatest on the internet concerning the Genesis role-playing game and any other amazing discoveries that we feel may be of interest to our listeners. So, what have we got this week? GM Huz.
So something I spotted on the Genesis Universal RPG System Facebook group was a Traveller Career Manager written by a fellow called Andy Cook. I've never played Traveller myself, but I am somewhat familiar with it just from years of being in the RPG community. I had a quick look through his PDF, and it's very, very well written. Essentially, what it is an extensive supplement for creating careers or managing your Traveller character careers in Genesis. So it's full of tables of various things and bits and pieces that build your character. It's very, very cool. He's done a lot of work on it, and I can tell he's very passionate about Traveller and Genesis. A passionate person usually makes for really great material.
Yep.
And this is no exception. Andy has laid it out very nicely and looks very legit, which is fantastic. He has written it for Traveller, but from what I had a look and glance over, you could really apply it to any sort of sci-fi system if you want to create careers for your characters and use that in whatever generic sci-fi game you happen to be playing in. So have a look at that. It's well worth it. He's done a good job.
Cool. Martin.
Well, for those of us that have been paying attention to the announcements from Fantasy Flight Games, there is the sneak peek available for the Realms of Terranoth Heroic Feats.
I'm very excited about that.
Yeah.
That looks great.
From what I understand, these sort of play a similar role to the...
Signature abilities?
Yes, that's the word I'm looking
The
for.
Genesis equivalent, I think.
Yeah, so that's pretty exciting, and I believe it can be sort of tailored to your character as well, which is really exciting.
You build your own heroic feat, and basically that as your character levels up, that heroic feat sort of
It goes with you.
yeah, it does, which is great. And the heroic feat is completely up to you. From reading what the sneak peek suggests, there's a heap of core abilities for the heroic ability. Then you add your own sort of flair to it as well, other bits and pieces.
Which is really what this system does well. So.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be a good. I think it's worth asking if this will be a similar feature they put into future setting books and just reskin it appropriately
Even
where
if
needed.
it's not, we can just do it.
Absolutely.
Well, one of the things that they mention on the article is they talk about superheroes.
Oh,
Yeah.
as well.
do they? I missed that.
So there's a part in there that they say that you could use this in your
there you
superhero
go.
campaigns. So I think that if this is something that they're going to do with their setting books, is obviously that'll be focused on one particular thing, but it will be a little bit modular, so you can actually pull from those things and do with that. So I'm keen to see what they do with that.
That's what I've always been looking forward to with these Realms books, is that they will just expand our available tools.
And honestly, I like the idea of a character starting with these because signature abilities are great, but it's a massive, if you're familiar with it from playing the Star Wars RPG, it's a long road to get to a signature ability.
Yeah.
And if you've started in a career you're locked to the signature ability of that career. Even if your character has branched out into other careers and his original career isn't so much what he is
Not even
anymore.
really relevant.
Exactly, he's still stuck with that original rules as written, that is, original signature ability. This one here, you pick it and it immediately tells the world or tells the people around the table who your character is and what cool flair they bring to the table. And the fact that you build your own is so cool. I can't wait to play with that. It's another reason to get excited for Terranoth, I think.
But yeah, take a look at that on Facebook or on the website. But what's next?
Yeah. Caitlin.
So we have, the next one is something that we are all very, very excited about, and that's that FFG have announced through Katarina Ostrider's Twitter account that an Android setting is on the way.
Super excited.
So yeah, I can't even express just how I want to get my hands on that like yesterday, but we will have to wait.
Yep.
But yeah, getting excited for something that is a really high sci-fi, which is something that's right up my alley, and a lot of people's, particularly around this table as well. And particularly getting a specified setting for this book as well. Super keen.
And I can ensure that book is going to look amazing because I've got trillions of Netrunner cards at home. Like Netrunner's my jam. Folders and folders and folders full of cards, and there's so much artwork that FFG have sitting on a file somewhere that they can throw into this book, and this book is going to be amazing. And it's going to be good as well because someone mentioned on our, when this very first got announced, we had a Facebook post about it, and someone asked, how could you make a good Genesis setting in Android/Netrunner? Which sort of, I'll be honest, I left my head scratching. I scratched my head a little bit about it because it's a very, very rich setting. If you look at it just from the Netrunner perspective, which is a card game that's based on one small element of that world.
It's a very small slice.
Very small slice. It's about hackers essentially, or runners, what they call it in Android, breaking into corporations' databases to get agendas. It doesn't really take into account the whole world around it. And Android is a very long established setting for FFG, only made sort of brought to the forefront from Netrunner, because Netrunner existed before FFG controlled it. It was a Wizards of the Coast game originally, and it was a collectible card game, and it was set in its own sort of generic cyberpunk universe. So when FFG acquired it, they chucked it in their Android universe, and it worked beautifully. So that's really made their Android universe, flare up. So I think it's pretty exciting for everyone who's not so much familiar with that Android setting. So it's a bit of a learning curve for everyone, I think.
And once again, I'm just looking forward to it for the things that it will add to anyone that wants to do anything sci-fi.
Exactly. That's right.
And the other thing that I found, and I'm scrolling through trying to find it now, but I can't actually find it, and I said to the person that I would mention it, and that's that somebody had a setting for Warcraft. They've only just started it, and it's got an example career, but it looked really, really good. And I'm trying to find it, and I can't find it, but I will mention it in the next episode.
Did you just dream this again?
No, I wish I did, but no, I didn't.
I'm just going to mention this because I hope someone does it, because I don't have time to do it.
Right.
I would love to see a Warhammer fantasy setting.
And there's a lot of stuff that obviously they can get from FFG's old stuff too. So,
But
it would be hard to convert Terranoth over to it. A lot of your fantasy tropes are painted in that book, so it's just a matter of adding a grim horror that the fantasy world would bring, and off you go.
Yet another reason to look forward to this book.
Exactly. That's a good point to make. Like Terranoth, even if you're not a Terranoth fan, don't know much about it. Like, we're not huge Terranoth fans here at this table, but we're eager to learn more. However, if you just want a generic fantasy book that paints all the tropes for you, Terranoth will be good for that.
Just file off the serial number.
That's it.
Yeah, you're done.
Well, their heroic feats are something that I would be keen to see in something like a Borderlands one as well. So when you look at Borderlands, you each have your own little stick, right? Yeah. So imagine, even adapting what they have in Realms of Terranoth to your other settings. So Borderlands, like, to me, I really want a Borderlands one, but I want to GM a Borderlands one because I want to play all the NPCs that you come against. But that would be just all those different things that you can do.
You know, it'd be cool if you had heroic feats in a Borderlands one, right? Add a bit of a video gamey spin to it, and you have to accrue points until you can use your heroic charges up. You have to spend advantages to charge up your heroic.
That's
ability.
actually cool. Storing up advantages,
which is completely doesn't make any sense in the real world.
We need to do another setting roulette.
Okay, But we're getting so off
No,
topic.
it's not.
But
But yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, let's not destroy those creative juices because we've still
come
got
back to that.
Yes, we'll come back to that shortly with the core of the show. But the other thing that we should probably mention as well, the mic stand. There are a couple of new articles that GM Huzz has presented on the Facebook website. So yeah, take a look at those. The most recent one was to roll or not to roll, which was very, very interesting.
personally
I
a
thought.
fan of this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And goes through the explanation. So when you're in a scenario, do you really need to roll those dice to progress the story? Or is it just something that you can either flip a destiny point or you can just move on
Just
completely? Hand wave it, and so that it doesn't destroy the flow of the setting itself. So yeah.
The really compressed version of that article, you can fit in one sentence. If it's not interesting, if you wouldn't find it interesting to watch on film,
Yep.
don't make a roll.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Simple as that. That's your rule of thumb.
And the other cool thing that we've started as well, which has been fairly popular, I thought, is the Interpret This, which is we create a scenario for our listeners and show them kind of up to a certain point where the dice get rolled. You then get to see the results of the dice roll, and then it's up to you to determine what that is. What's the prize? Nothing. It's just really cool.
It is, and it gets everyone's creative juices flowing, which is great, and really encourage people to jump in there, have a look, and it's good exercise too if you're new to GMing or even playing and you're new to the system.
Yep.
Read other people's examples,
Yeah.
and jump in there if you own and type something up. No idea is a bad idea, and if you feel like yours mightn't be that great, who cares? Chuck it up and use others to learn from. Essentially,
Exactly right. And we'll be putting one of those up each week, which will be good fun. So yeah, we'll keep an eye out for that. Our first one happens to be based on Knight's Edge, which is our own little campaign setting, and yeah, it's been fairly popular so far. So look out for the next one this week.
All right, so now that we've said all of that, make sure you subscribe and review us on whatever platform you're listening to us on. It's a huge help for us and also lets people know that we're there. So like, subscribe, comment, review, and message. We want to hear what you have to say and want to hear what you want to hear next.
So if you have any questions for us or you want to have a bit of a chat with us, don't be afraid to track us down at Dice Pool Podcast on Facebook and Twitter. You can also find us on YouTube these days where we've got our episodes linked up there, which is fantastic. So you can also watch or consume us there. I don't know why you would want to consume us, but you know, whatever. And be sure to get in touch with us via our email, at info@thedicepoolpodcast.com, or you can visit us on our website, thedicepoolpodcast.com.
Cool. So should we get into probably the most exciting part of the show, our show topic for tonight?
Don't you mean core of the show?
Yeah, good call. Core of the show. And welcome to Core of the Show, the segment where we will take a deep dive into a topic concerning the Genesis role-playing game and, of course, gaming in general. Tonight's episode could be considered to be a continuation of our previous episode where we've taken the next step in setting design using the ideas that we've generated during our Setting Roulette and defining it more mechanically, as it were. So, as I said, in our last episode, we did the Setting Roulette where we've developed a complete setting based on 4 completely random elements, which we've all drawn from random pieces of paper, which was a lot of fun. So, Mike, would you like to give us a bit of a quick snapshot of the outcome of our setting?
Well, a quick snapshot is probably a tricky term to use in this one, but yeah, our setting involves werewolves, fighting off the back of airships, magic, and fighting shadow creatures. So as you can imagine, that's a fairly interesting mix of things. However, we sat down over the course of that episode 6, and post-episode recording and developed a pretty cool world where we have werewolves working with humans to fight the ghostly remnants of the vampires that dwell within this fractured world. It's pretty in-depth, so we definitely recommend listening to episode 6 before continuing on with this episode.
Cool. Now that we've got our ideas for our setting effectively laid out before us on our setting sheet, which is available for your downloading pleasure, on the Dice Ball podcast website. We're going to be going through what the Genesis rulebook outlines when it comes to creating a setting, plus letting you, the listener, know what we have done in developing the setting since that last episode. So, shall we get started?
Absolutely.
Sounds good.
Let's do it.
All right, so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to go through and step through the process. So for those who are listening at home, the Game Master's Toolkit is where you'll spend most of your time if you want to be looking at what we're sort of working on. So that's on page 189 of the Genesis Core Rulebook.
Or our Bible, you could call it.
Or our Bible. Exactly right. Thank you, Sister Caitlin.
Praise be to Genesis.
So what we've effectively what happens in each of the settings, because the Game Master's Toolkit talks about how you set up the setting, and it sort of has it very broken up almost throughout the entire rulebook. So the book covers 6 different settings. So what we've done is we've sort of pulled a little bit from here and there for our own settings. But what it has is in each of the settings, it has it basically broken up into 4 areas. So it has tropes, characters, gear, and adversaries. Okay? There is a whole heap of subheadings in amongst all of that, but that's effectively the 4 main areas that you're looking at. So firstly, what we'll do is we'll go through each one of the steps, and we'll use our own setting to sort of fill in the blanks so that people can have a bit of an example of how we've used those to create our setting for a start. But firstly, tropes. Martin, would you like to explain to us what the definition of a trope is?
Yes, because I asked this question myself. Because the word is one that gets used a lot, but what is a trope?
Yeah.
Now, it's generally defined as a significant or recurrent theme or a motive. And this is what sort of defines our setting, is what common threads have we placed throughout it.
That's right. All right, so in this circumstance, or in our setting, what do we set as our trope? Michael?
Yeah, so our setting uses a fair few fairly common tropes, but we've added our own spin to them. But in broad strokes, a few tropes that we're using is our magic-powered technology. So we have airships, weapons, guns, swords, other bits and pieces which are powered by attuned magic, which is not unique to our setting. There's been plenty of other fantasy settings which use this, mainly mage punk sort of style settings. So we've included that into our own. Another one we have is Fall of Humanity. Humanity as it existed in the world prior to the big devastation and the cataclysm that caused the current events of the world to unfold. Humanity has fallen and they've had to regrow from the ashes essentially, which is a fairly common trope for post-apocalyptic sort of games. So we're running with that trope ourselves. Then the classic light versus the dark, and in our case it's very literal as well. There's very clear definition between the good and the bad, and the good's trying to overcome the bad whilst the bad's trying to overthrow the good. So they're 3 fairly common tropes that we've injected into our own game or our own setting.
And with the light versus dark, it's effectively where each of them are existing. Yeah.
Because when you look at the setting sheet as well, it actually looks at proposing the tropes in different ways. So it asks the questions of what tropes are you including, what are you excluding, so you can actually go, well, this is definitely not what it is versus what it actually is, and then also what are you subverting. So the book has a little bit of that in when you're looking at the chapters of the specific ones, but the setting sheet does explicitly ask you to look at those 3 areas as well, and we've done that for this one.
Yeah.
So for subverting, just in terms of keeping it in theme with what we are including, we have subverted magic to be somewhat of a shattered type of thing, where the main source of magic and arcane ability is from the lightning that is harvested from the clouds. So that's a really key trope for us, because that's at the core of all of the worlds and societies that we're looking at.
Key subverted trope. Because magic isn't this thing that a magic user can just summon out of thin air anymore. You have to physically harvest the magic and contain it.
It's a resource.
It's a resource, which is a little bit different to most magic-themed games. So we've subverted the magic theme.
Yep.
And also not everyone can access it.
Correct.
In terms of it has some guidelines around how it can actually be used versus magic is for everyone and it's super fun. The other one is forced to work with monsters. So when we're looking at the current species and archetypes and all that kind of stuff that we're looking at for this world, we have a few key areas, but one of the main one is the fact that human society has to work with with the werewolves. So that's a one that we've actually changed a little bit, because normally when you look at monsters in terms of these types of settings, the monsters are the ones that are the evil ones that you're fighting against, and not always the ones that you have to partner with.
They're usually the big bads.
Correct. Yeah. So this one is actually trying to moving the werewolves onto a more of a level playing field with the humans in terms of allowing PCs to play them and having them as key parts of, the heroes, whereas the vampires are the epitome of all the monsters that we're looking at. So it's changing that one that you would normally think as a normal trope and changing it into putting a little bit of a spin on it.
So really we're answering the question of who's a good boy?
Well, it's an interesting trope to subvert, because the werewolves, because usually if you have a werewolf player in a group in any other fantasy type setting, there's usually a fair few strings attached to it asking why a werewolf would be working for a player. In this scenario, in our own setting, werewolves are almost as common as people, so there's no having to try and wedge a werewolf into the party. It fits the world. The werewolves are just there. They're another race, just like any other. And another one we've subverted, which I've only really just thought about, is the vampires themselves. Vampires aren't your classic,
Blah, blah.
yeah, your Vlad types or your underworld types or whatever. Yeah.
Very good at accounting.
Excellent at accounting. But our ones are more ethereal and ghostly. They no longer have physical form anymore.
Yeah.
They reside in a shadowy darkness. And so they've become more menacing in the way now that they're not a tangible thing anymore. They've become what's a good word for it?
Well, we've described them as inky darkness.
Yeah, inky
Shadows.
darkness.
So, and the common word for them within this world is shadows. But the best way to look at it is just like imagine if, all these tentacles and all these things come out of like this shadowy mass that looks like black ink. And it's the remnants of whatever their evil energy was that's left. It's no longer the, hunting beautiful women in the shadow of night kind of thing, or even hunting beautiful women at night who can also kill them violently. It is a very different take on what the essence of vampirism
Which is
was.
cool.
Well, I think that in last episode, Michael described it as if you throw ink into water, and that's sort of the look and feel. Yeah. That's sort of what you're looking at.
But you're looking at it and it's got malign intent.
Yes, yes.
And it's cool because that inky darkness is the deeper you go into our fractured world, the more the inky darkness becomes another reality almost. You slip from our real reality into this hellscape essentially.
Yeah.
So you can't really tell where the reality slips. It's just this gradual thing. So the deeper you go, the more you'll go into the vampires, or whatever's left of the vampires. You go into their ultimate lair.
Their hellish domain.
Into their combined wretched souls, which are swimming in this inky darkness.
Yeah.
Well, next we''ve got what tropes or themes are we excluding? It's pretty straightforward, because this world was once your sort of high fantasy sort of setting, but that's long since passed.
Well before the cataclysm.
Well before the cataclysm, which I think we called the Great Fracture.
The Great Fracture, yeah, that's it.
And so these the elves and the dwarves and all of those classic fantasy species,
fantasy tropes, you could say.
Fantasy tropes have passed into myth and legend. Did they ever really exist?
Yeah.
The people of this world aren't sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've excluded that. It's just these vampires, werewolves, humans, and a couple of others that we'll get into. And it's just hinted at.
Yeah. And obviously one of the things that we decided as well is that with your typical fantasy setting where you have elves and whatever else, that we've even gone to the stage of not just removing them, but removing their backstory so that they could be there if we wanted to explore that as a story later on down the track. But we've not given any sort of answers. And I think that's something which, as a GM, if you're using a particular setting, that you don't have to go through and answer every single question. You can leave those questions unanswered, because also if you're designing a setting to go and be free in the world so that other people can use that setting, you don't want it to be. You don't want them to
lock
be
yourself down.
No, you don't want them to be locked down.
You don't want to build brick walls for no reason. You want to allow people to do whatever they want and play around.
Because if you keep building brick walls, eventually you're going to pen yourself in.
Exactly.
And really, how cool would it be if after you've had enough of playing with whatever this setting is and you want to try and expand on it, bringing out some shadow elves that come out of the play and start to coming in, or shadow dwarves or anything like that could potentially happen.
Hey, maybe they found another way to survive down below.
Life finds a way.
Well, we've already discussed that there's possibly, the world is built upon or using passive magics of an ancient race.
Things in place. Yeah.
Exactly, that no one really understands because it's forgotten myth, but it's still there and it's still working. So it's interesting that by excluding stuff, we're also bringing stuff into our story, which is interesting and gives it more mystique.
Yeah.
So in essence, when it comes to people designing their own setting, they need to be looking at what sort of tones are going to be, or what sort of tropes that they're going to be using, what sort of tropes that they want to change and manipulate, and what sort of tones that they need to remove. That's essentially it.
Speaking of tones, what is our tone?
All right. Well, our tone, I think, it's kind of a fantasy horror, and I know that horror does get mentioned in the back of the rulebook on page 241 of the Genesis core rulebook. But we've decided to call it grim dark fantasy.
It suits it a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree.
Because when you say horror, it sort of gives the impression that every moment of the role play has to be horror filled. In our one, there may necessarily be horror around every corner. You could have your very everyday political intrigue campaign in the main cities, but so it still has this undertone of grim dark horror.
Because the moment that you dip below the clouds, that's when the horror starts to kick in.
Horror on,
That's right.
It's almost like the tone is really about the adventure that you're going to create as a GM using this setting. So how you want your adventure to play out, that's when the tone, which is different to the tropes, actually comes into play.
Yep, and it's also the sort of rules that you're going to be applying as well. So in the core rulebook, they obviously have tones such as superheroes and horror, where horror uses a lot more of that. Yeah, it uses the fear mechanic, and I think that in our setting, definitely fear is going to play a part, certainly in relation to some of the adversaries, and we'll get onto that later on.
Well, going by what just GM Caitlin just said, that tone sort of tells the players and the GMs what sort of adventure they're going to be having. Another way to think of it is when you go into a bookstore or a video store and they've got the movies or books in categories. You have your horror movies, your sci-fi, your fantasy, etc. Immediately before even picking one of those books or DVDs up, you know what you're in for.
Exactly.
That's what players, as soon as they see they're playing in a horror setting, they know they're going to be in for a horror setting. So it's a good way to give a very broad, very, very broad stroke to your campaign.
Absolutely. All right, so that's kind of the tropes and tones that we've explored for our setting. So as I said, tropes, page 122, tones, 241. The next part of the process is obviously looking at the characters. Now, according to the rulebook, we're starting to look at skills, archetypes, species, and obviously the talents. However, the most important thing to look at is obviously whereabouts of those sorts of characters, whereabouts those sorts of archetypes are going to come from.
And how they fit.
And how they fit into the overall world. So for ours, Caitlin, would you like to take us through that?
So to start off, before looking at the Genesis rulebook, essentially, and how to create this, we looked at the character sheet and developed that, as you heard in the last episode, where we had a look more about the types of major factions and organizations that are in the setting and what their objectives are. And I think that a lot of that as well came out naturally when we were trying to talk about what the setting is going to be, and we even created some of the characters from that conversation as well. So, and when we're looking at the major factions and organizations within the setting, we've broken it down into a number of different groups based on the type of species that you would see within each of those groups and factions. Now, keeping in mind the werewolves and the humans do work together, but we have separated them for the purpose of identifying their objectives and their factions within this setting. So you could almost amalgamate them, but at the moment we're just going to keep them separate so we can clearly identify their different roles within this world.
Sure.
So the first one that we have is the vampiric shadows. So as we described before, they're the inky dark mass that's basically corrupted whatever is left of Lux and Tenebris, which was the world before it fractured. It's still called Lux and Tenebris, but to the people up above the clouds, it's a no land anymore. But basically, the vampiric shadows is what remains in that shattered core of the world. They grow deeper, and it bleeds into whatever is happening above the clouds or within the clouds, kind of thing. So it's this dark touch that has completely turned the center of whatever is left of the world into this hellish domain that the deeper you go, the more twisted it becomes, because that is pure, in essence, pure evil. Which is what is the only thing that's keeping the world together, but also effectively was what broke it apart to begin with.
Yep.
So that is the vampiric shadows. They're the ones that can come through the clouds and start attacking, and they want their freedom. And that is also where the lead vampire, which we discussed in the last episode, where she resides. The next one that we have is the werewolves. So they were basically the race that, other than humans, that survived and kind of took over. They became more powerful than mankind, and they have the great wolf king who cannot go back into being a human. Well, not going back to a human, but can't transform back into a human. So he is constantly staying, and all the werewolves are constantly remaining in their werewolf state. And part of what they really want is to collect as much resources as they can, but eventually bring down the demise of the vampires and whatever is left of them. That rivalry just doesn't end just because the vampires are no longer what they once were. They're still the essence of them. And that, that fight will continue. And also, because the werewolves are stuck in that constant state, they want liberation just as much as the vampires want their liberation from their hellscape. So fighting together, the only way the werewolves can see that ending is to destroy whatever is left and potentially whatever is left of the world.
It's probably worth mentioning that the werewolves are very dependent on the humans, because in their agitated werewolfy state, they're unable to attune or use vital magical instruments that they use to wage the wars, namely the airships and zeppelins.
Which leads perfectly into the next one, which is the humans. So as we mentioned, we separated them. So humans are able to attune to the magic of whatever is left in the world, and a key part of that is the arcane lightning that is found in the clouds that are encompassing the world that's left. So because the werewolves are unable to change back into being human, and the humans are the only ones that are able to really touch that magical element, and that enables the powering of ships, the weapons, or any of those types of things. They've basically developed almost like a symbiotic relationship.
It's a good word.
Yeah.
The other part, though, as well, is that werewolves are the only ones that are able to permanently destroy
Correct. Worth
Yeah.
mentioning.
the shadows.
Yeah, so they need the humans just as much as the humans need the werewolves to help fight and bring about whatever their objectives is. And for the humans, they've created, werewolves and humans have created these city-states, which is where all the cities float above the clouds and basically govern whatever is left of, for lack of a better word, humanity or society. So that's a bit of the human side. And then there's also Shade Moon, which we talked about, which is a faction that supports the black market, the underworld, the underbelly, lawless land for all the criminals, that is run by one particular man, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about some of the characters and lead people we've created.
Because I think in the previous episode we were talking about having it as Shadowport,
Yes.
but we decided that was sort of a little bit too generic, so we wanted to call it something else.
Very Star Warsy.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
Star Warsy. So we've sort of gone with the Shade Moon, which is kind of
Much
cool.
better.
Yes. So that's the one where we were talking about that it's basically this spherical mass that's been made up of all the fractured elements of the old world that's been tethered together by insane webs of structures. So that is in essence a faction of its own within this larger setting as well.
So the other thing to mention in regards to the Shade Moon, before we move on, is that part of the reason why it is called Shade Moon is that there is the most dominant species that lives on this place is the outcasts, those humans that have and people that have been touched by the shadow. So they're called shade touched.
Yep.
And so that's where they generally reside.
Which we'll get into a little bit more detail about what shade touched actually means when we actually get into the archetype species and talents and all that kind of fun stuff.
That's right.
But yes, that's right. That's where they reside. That's where they live. It's basically where all the outcasts go, because no one else will have them. They're packless.
It is a wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Yes. And last but not least, we talked about in the last episode about potentially a city that has fallen below the clouds and has actually descended and broken whatever barrier that was actually keeping the shadows at bay. And that was the lost city of Theresa. So that as well is basically one that we've created as its own faction, because whilst it is just one of the city-states, it's the one of the city-states that has recently fallen and is basically a catalyst for the setting of where we are at now. So as with every story that you need to have an event that creates something interesting for the characters to react to and to grow and to challenge them. So if it was just a normal everyday setting, you'd have to create something to make it the characters have to do something different to their normal day lives. So this is the lost city of Theresa. Now, it was a mainly human-based city that was run by a queen. So there was a hierarchy of within its own little city-state. But it was one of the swanky hierarchies that was there. So the queen and the land, basically, they fell victim to their own hubris. So when they were calling for help, no one else went to help them, because why would you help the super rich and famous?
Well, they were notoriously xenophobic and isolationist. So they never helped anyone else. So why would anyone help them?
Yeah. So basically, as they fell and as the city fell due to lack of power and resources, it fell into darkness, and their cries for help went unanswered. There was a few from Theresa who was able to escape. Which we will again talk about more when we talk about the individual characters and leaders within this world. But that's a pretty pivotal moment. I think one of the examples we talked about in the last episode was in Star Wars Knights of the Republic, the fall of Taris. That was a huge faction or huge event or a huge society that actually impacted the lives of all the characters in all the different worlds as well. So we thought we'd include that as a faction because it's key, even if they weren't well liked.
It's probably worth mentioning too, because you touched on it very briefly when you're describing Theresa. When the reason why the fall of Theresa is so important is because many of the larger city-states each contain a artifact, that is one in many which power this magical aura around the world, and it's what keeps the world from totally falling apart.
And no one actually really knows about these things.
It's a sort of unknown, but now it's a known thing now that Theresa has fallen, because now there's a chink in the armor, and the darkness has seen that. And if they can sink the other city-states, soon enough the darkness won't be contained anymore, and it can break its bonds, more or less.
And the reason why we brought that in was for two reasons. And it was purely because we started asking questions of, well, the first one was, how do these things stay afloat? So by answering that, we've gone, magic. Right, well, it's magic. But
the best example of reason for everything.
But we've sort of said, we need some sort of focus for that to happen. So there's these sort of relic-type structures that nobody really knows what they do.
Or how they work.
Or how they work. And these cities have just managed to be built around these structures, whether they be from, like, ancients or something like that, who knows. But that's sort of a mystery that can be explored by the GM as they go.
Yeah, and that's why they require so much magic in order to stay that way, and and they realise now that there's a secondary effect of keeping the darkness at bay.
That's right.
You can do so much in the way of cool, like, plot hooks and story ideas with that. Like, the GM could run it that the Shadows knew that Theresa was a weak point in humanity and the werewolves, and by organising its collapse, has started the chain reaction required to really get their freedom off the ground.
Yep. And the other thing as well is that it's showing to the audience or the players who are playing in the campaign that this floating city thing that is happening is not something that is just going to keep on happening.
Yeah, it's
There is
infallible.
it's something that can fail, and it's something that everybody has to be working towards not happening to their own city.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a couple of interesting tropes there about what happens when you're not using your fellow humans to work together because they're an entire city who decided not to work with everybody else. And look what happened to them.
Yeah, it's not to get too political with it, but it's a perfect reflection of mankind through history, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't we work together? All this bad stuff keeps happening. And that's usually what
that's
happens.
almost a trope within itself.
It is.
It is.
So yeah. But anyway, getting back to what we were talking about. All right, so now that we've looked at the factions within our setting, we now have to look at, obviously, the types of characters, such as, the species and the archetypes, careers, talent, skills, that sort of thing, so that the players have got
Something to play with.
something to play with, exactly. So what we decided that first off is one of the most important things is obviously to set the skill set. So, Michael, would you like to take us through our skills?
All right, so for our skills in the setting, we started with the general skills first because they're usually the most common ones and most kept ones out of all the skills, no matter what setting you're in. But those we have kept are athletics, coordination, discipline, mechanics, medicine, perception, piloting, resilience, riding, skullduggery, stealth, streetwise, survival, and vigilance. Now, it's worth mentioning we changed,
Astronavigation.
Astronavigation to just navigation, and we've added that to our general skills list. It's more or less the same thing, but the name for it is more generalised and fitting for our setting.
Exactly.
And how are they going to be using the navigation setting? The navigation skill.
I guess navigation in our setting is, you're plotting a course from one city-state to the other via airship.
Or down into the darkness.
Down into darkness. Yep. And that could work in conjunction with some other skills we've got. Now, there is one general skill found in Genesis which you'd probably think would fit in our setting, and that was alchemy. We talked about this, for a fair while, and we decided to leave it out, mainly because none of us really thought about it when we were creating the setting, so we figured it's probably not something we have in our setting. Because magic is a more tangible thing already, alchemy, which is already a tangible magic, would be adding another layer of tangible magic upon tangible magic. So we decided just keep it simple and leave it out.
And
However...
and also with alchemy, a lot of the herbs and things that you'd use to create this no longer exist.
Or be very, very hard to find and come by, which would sort of render alchemy irrelevant anyway.
Yeah. Mainly because we don't have a landmass.
But in saying that, the GM could, if you decided to play the setting,
you could include it.
Add alchemy. There's nothing stopping you. Next would be the combat skills. Most of your general ones are here. Nothing changes too much. We've got brawl, gunnery, melee. Now we didn't just make it distinguish. We didn't distinguish between the types of melee. We just got one straight melee skill, regardless of the melee weapon you happen to be using. However, we do have ranged heavy and ranged light because we figured most of the time, most of the characters will be using ranged weapons over melee weapons in this setting. So we thought the distinction was still fairly important because a musket and a pistol and whatnot are very distinct weapons, different from each other.
And we decided that gunnery was going to be the sort of skill that you would be using when you're using the ship's weapons, like cannons and things like that.
Your normal ship's weapons. So if you've got a cannon mounted on it, sure. And if you've got sometimes you might have a fly atmosphere. You'd have like flyers, like your old propeller ships. They would have regular weapons on them and things like that.
And a cannon and a gunnery could still be a man-carried weapon too, like a grenade launcher or something like that as well.
Right.
So, then there's social skills. Now, social skills, very, very common stuff. Nothing too special here. We've kept charm, coercion, deception, negotiation, and leadership. I don't think we changed anything there.
I don't think so.
No.
Those ones very rarely change.
Yeah, exactly.
But we did identify that leadership was actually going to be a particularly important one within the werewolves. So when we're looking later on down the track, when you're looking at different ones in order to, get other wolves to do what you do, leadership was going to be one that was like pretty paramount for them, considering pack mentality.
All right, now knowledge skills. Now knowledge is something that is fairly setting specific. Now we created 4 knowledge skills for our setting. We chose to stick to 4 to avoid
Skill bloat.
Skill bloat. Yeah, exactly.
Generally, 4 is a good number.
Good number. Yeah. If you're doing more than 4, then you might be risking that bloat, as you
Or
say.
there's some sort of setting specific reason.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like in Star Wars, for example, there is Outer Rim and Core World.
True.
Because the galaxy is a big place, obviously they've decided that they wanted to split that knowledge base up into 2 specific areas.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So we've added knowledge criminal, knowledge education, knowledge fractured lands, and knowledge history. Now, the knowledge skills by title alone are fairly self-explanatory. Criminal, obviously your character's knowledge of the criminal underworld and the undergoings and the who's who and etc. Education. Now, education is a fairly, what would you call it?
A catch-all.
A catch-all, that's right. And anything that doesn't fit into the other 3 knowledge skills would probably come under education.
And this is where you'd find your heraldry of your families and your upper class.
Yep. Then there's knowledge fractured lands, and that's your knowledge of essentially the evilness and whatnot below. It's the dark shadows and shades and all the...
And the places that still remain.
Yeah. So it's very forbidden knowledge, I guess you could say.
It's very dark.
Yeah, dark stuff.
Yeah. It's below the Night's Edge.
Yeah. And lastly is history. History is fairly obvious as well. It's your character's knowledge of past events.
Which can go back before the fracture.
Obviously, exactly, yeah. So it's a fairly important one to have as well.
Normally associated with an impossible check.
Yeah. However, there is 2 new skills we've added to this setting, which are quite unique to the setting and replace the magic skills you would find on the generic Genesis character sheet.
Yeah, because we've played a bit with the magic system, and we'll get into that later. But we've got the two that we've chosen are both attunement skills. So that's the magic of this world.
Yep.
We have attunement martial, which keys off of cunning, and attunement seer, which keys off of willpower.
Okay.
Not to get too deep into it, but in this world we discussed in the last episode that there were the people that attuned to the ships. Okay, and they piloted in these like sensory deprivation chambers. They become one with the ship. They're our seers, okay, because they transpose their consciousness into this, and they can see the way and all sorts of different things. And then the attunement martial is the one where you attune to weapons and other devices that are more personal scale.
Where you're basically putting the magic into a particular item. You're infusing it.
Well, you attune with it in order to operate it.
Yeah.
Magic is a big subject in the setting, which we'll get into later on.
Yeah, exactly.
It's worth noting as well there's something very unique about those 2 skills. The only way you can actually add them to your character sheet is if you're playing an attuned human. If you're playing a werewolf or a shade touched, you do not have access to those 2 skills.
They're just not on your sheet,
which is fairly unique, and not many settings that I know of have unique skills like that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
That's our skills.
Cool. So now that we've worked out the skills, which are kind of the focus for where everything else goes, we took a look at the species. Now, we decided that there was just going to be 3 core species, but each species was going to have something a little bit different to it. So what we decided on is we had werewolves, we had shade touched, as well as the attuned humans. Now, we've created each one of these species. We actually use the rules, which are on page 192 for those listening at home. But rather than going through each one of them, we will be making these available at a later stage when we do the full setting. But for a start, let's just take a look at probably the one that I found the most interesting to do, and that was the werewolf. So, Martin, would you like to take us through that process?
Yep. Now, I have done a little bit of archetype creation in one of our previous episodes. So basically, we've done the same thing. The way the book does it is it gives you a basic species profile, which is pretty malleable. But you have to define the starting characteristics, your wound threshold, strain threshold, starting experience, and special abilities and other unique rules. The starting profile starts with a 3 in one stat and a 1 in another. And that gives you a starting XP of 100.
Yep.
Okay, and a wound threshold of 10 in both. A 10 wound threshold of 10, and a strain threshold of 10. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And we also had, we then have 2s in everything else.
2s in everything else, yep. And your special ability that you get on the basic profile is 1 rank in a skill.
Right.
Okay. When you want to mess with that, you start talking about how you modify the starting experience.
Sure.
So what we've done is that we've given the werewolves, because they're constantly locked in their sort of war form, their wolf form. They have a brawn of 3, an agility of 3, an intellect of 1, a cunning of 2, a willpower of 1, and a presence of 2.
And where did we get that sort of the idea for that for a start?
Yeah, we looked at the steampunk setting, I believe it was, and they have a profile in there for what's called a mongrel, which has an alternate form of, sort of bestial features and sort of like a werewolf.
Yep.
And so we've sort of taken what that form was and locked it in permanently. Now, because of these changes, each time you go up to a 3, if you add a 3, you're going to add spend 30 XP, essentially. When you drop down, you spend 20 XP. So we'd lose 10 XP off of your starting XP, dropping us to 90. Then you play with the wound threshold. We've left the wound threshold at 10, so no changes there. 10 plus brawn. Strain is 8 plus willpower. So there's been a change there. And every time you drop your wound threshold by 1, you gain 5 XP. Right. And we've dropped it twice. So we're back to 100. The special ability. Now, we've kept the 1 rank of a skill, and we've put it in brawl. Okay. Now, that is because it's keyed to a stat that's at 3. It's worth a little bit more than what the standard book is.
Sure.
Okay, because it says if you're going to add that sort of thing, you'd take it to 10, and you'd make it worth that. So because normally you'd get that, we've taken it. It's cost us 5 XP.
Sure.
Dropped to 95.
Cool.
And then we've given them a few other abilities because this is our setting's pretty powerful.
It's worth making note of that.
Yeah, it is definitely worth making note of that. Everything is a little bit stronger here.
But it balances out because there's only each race is balanced against each other. So yeah, in a vacuum they might be more powerful. However, because they are the only 3 options, we can have them a little bit more powerful because they're not competing against anything else.
Yeah. Now, we've given them an ability here which is pretty narrative based. There's no actual mechanical crunch to it. So we haven't really changed our starting XP total.
Yep.
We've called it Anathema of Shadow.
What does that do?
Well, this is the ability that allows them to permanently slay a shadow. So if a werewolf makes an attack against a shadow creature using their claws and the attack causes wounds which exceed the creature's wound threshold, it's destroyed permanently.
Yep.
So there's, as I say, there's no mechanical crunch to that whatsoever. It's just in the story, this thing ceased to exist.
Because the shadows themselves, we kind of were going along the same sort of lines as sort of a classic vampire that if it's killed, it just sort of turns to its gaseous form and comes back at a later stage after it's returned to its coffin and stuff like that. So yeah, but in this case, the werewolves can kill it permanently. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then we've given them an ability we call Ferocious, which gives them their claw attack, which deals +1 damage when making an unarmed attack, and their unarmed attacks have a crit rating of 3. Now, this is straight from the book.
Yep.
Which has a cost of -5 XP. So we drop down to 90, I believe we're at. This is a little bit crunchy for everyone, so I sorry for going on about this.
It's an important thing to go through, and I think to someone who might be new to creating an archetype, it could be overwhelming.
It is.
So hearing someone explain it step by step could definitely help.
Yeah.
And there's also people who love this kind of thing as well, and like having the different ideas and the different things that shaped why the decisions were made in terms of making a setting can be really helpful to people who are wanting to do their own.
Yep. Exactly.
Now we've added an ability called Predatory, which is because they're when you're dealing with a giant hulking a ton of flesh that has claws and looks like your worst nightmare, it's a bit hard to relate to them. Yeah, so they get 2 setbacks to any social check when dealing with non-werewolves. So this is a negative. So we've given them back 5 XP, I think it was, for this.
Yep.
So that would take them back to 95. And then we've got what I think is the most interesting thing about the werewolves.
Yep.
Now, because they've sort of, their blood is diluted a little bit from where the werewolves were when the world was whole, because there is a bit of a curse upon them that we'll get into later, but they don't carry the full power of the werewolves of old. And this is represented in the different packs that now exist.
Yep.
So we've got an ability called Primal Pack, and at character creation, the character will choose a pack to which they were born. And each pack has a key element which forms a part of their beliefs and their training and what they retain from that, the original werewolves, like the king.
Yep.
So we've got the Prowlers. So if you'll select one of these. So the Prowlers gain a boost to any survival checks they make and can make skill checks, any skill check, without penalty due to sight based on scent. So they can use their nose to know things. Then you have the Mongrels, which may use brawn instead of willpower when making a coercion check. Now, this is a pretty damn powerful ability.
It's amazing. However, it's worth mentioning because it's a social check. If they try and use their coercion against a non-werewolf, even with high ranks in brawn and coercion, they're still going to have 2 setback when they're trying to intimidate a human or a non-werewolf. Because a non-werewolf is going to miss the subtle body language clues that a werewolf would have when trying to intimidate someone. Because
this is the posturing of wolves in order to convey messages to others.
Exactly.
This is how they flatten their ears back and they start snarling. This is how they intimidate.
Yep.
Yeah. And then you've got the werewolves, and so they're pretty straightforward. They gain 1 soak, so plus 1 soak, and they increase their wound threshold by 2. They're just brutal.
They are. They're the min-max's favourite, I believe, we decided. But each of those 3 primal pack types bring a very unique flavour to the character you want to build. There's so many cool options. Like, I would love to play a Prowler mechanic. As you said, can sniff out problems on the ship when there's damage and whatnot. They also double as a ship's sensor system, more or less. They can smell when danger's coming. It's so cool.
Yeah. Now, because these abilities are pretty powerful, as we said, these races are a bit stronger than your average. We've priced them on average, because you choose one, at about 15 XP. So dropping that 95 down to 80. So when making a werewolf, you've got a pretty strong stat line as it is. You're only going to have 80 XP to spend.
Cool.
Yep.
This is them. That's done.
It's also worth mentioning as well that when you're creating an archetype, there's no exact precise science when it comes to distinguishing what's worth what. You can roughly ballpark it, like we've ballparked, but used the guide to do so.
Exactly. But it's got some examples, but like with the Primal Pack, it's just
exactly when you have different abilities can be so variable. You have to look at it sometimes and go, okay, well, maybe this is worth 5 XP less or 5 XP more than what it really adds up to. It's a bit of a balancing act, and you basically get more of a gut feeling for that as you play the game more.
Sure. And look, there's nothing, I don't think, to prevent people when they're going through and creating their own settings, that after, even if they've started playing, to go, that kind of doesn't necessarily work and may need to be adjusted. So, as long as there's understanding of that right from the start, that everybody is made aware that some of the things may change just due to how powerful things are, just make sure that they're all aware of that before you start play. And so for the last part, we talk about talents that are going to be used. Now, for the most part, we decided that there's not going to be too many talents other than what we have in the core rules. Now, we've also made it available that some talents can be used from the what's it called?
The ultimate super duper talent list.
The ultimate super talent,
Which is
whatever it's called.
available on the FFG board.
Exactly. We have that linked on the Diceball podcast website as well that you can download. But we did create a couple of extra talents, did we not, Martin?
Well, there's one at the moment, but there will be more.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just simply, this is covered on page 194 of the book, and I'm not going to go through all of that because it just talks about, how this is going to fit into the world, what it does, all of that sort of thing. But I'll just tell you what we've created.
Yep.
So I've created it's a tier 3 talent, I believe, although we may change that to a tier 2 depending on how we go.
Sure.
It's a passive talent. Okay, now you get other types that are active and it requires an action to use. But this one's just passive. And I've called it Arcane Mechanics. Okay. Now, this is because in our world, anyone can maintain these sky ships or these weapons or whatever using mechanics. Anyone can play with it and repair them because it's just mechanics. But to learn how to actually build them, it's another thing. Not everyone can do this. So you have to purchase this talent in order to give a new use to the skill of mechanics. Okay, and that allows you to get access to these new rules that allow you to create these items. We're not going to go through the rules of how to create them,
obviously.
But that's what this talent does, and that's how you can create these.
Exactly. And creating this talent in particular is a good example of how you can create one talent that can really reshape the whole archetype of how a character's built. You play an engineer character, all of a sudden he becomes this cool arcane engineer. And a talent doesn't necessarily need to give you heaps of cool mechanical buffs or alterations. It can just allow your character or your players' characters to do things.
And it is key to note that mechanics is available to anyone.
Exactly.
As is this talent.
Yep.
Cool. So when you were talking before about creating ships, could that also be used for, say, creating arcane weapons or things like that?
Yep.
Cool. So the last part of the process, however, was obviously looking at careers that we could have for our characters. Caitlin.
So the ones that have been created is Spell Slinger, Seer, Engineer, Berserker, Buccaneer, Sneak, Surgeon, Aeronaut, Marine, Wanderer.
Now, Michael, would you like to take us through one of those? Because each of those careers sets the scene for what jobs are in our world.
Yeah.
So, obviously, for each one of these careers, that we have to choose 8 skills that could then be linked into their careers that they have as career skills. So, it costs 5 XP less to take a rank in one of those. So, Michael, would you like to go through one of those just to give us a bit of an example?
Sure thing. I will go through the Spell Slinger. Now, we created each of these careers using a rough guide of skill spread, I guess you could say, where there's a sort of a good balance between social skills, combat skills, and general skills. Because if you're not careful, you can have one career that's very potent or too potent at combat, or not potent enough at one thing. So there is a bit of a
balancing act.
Balancing act, that's right, of what you want to do. Here's one tricky thing. The Genesis rulebook doesn't actually give a guide for creating a career. However, Keith Capel was very kind enough to give us a breakdown of roughly how it should be done. And if you look at the careers as this in the book and use them as a rough guide anyway, you can get an idea of how a career is created. Because all it is at the end of the day is a matter of selecting 8 skills, which become career skills for that career. Now, the one we created was the Spell Slinger. Now, this is the one that wields magically attuned weapons. He's the character who's going to be taking the fight to the shades, using these weapons that are infused with this arcane lightning. He's the combat version of the Seer who pilots the ships. So his skills are Attunement Martial, Charm, Cool, Coordination, Knowledge Education, Knowledge History, Negotiation, and Perception. So the Spell Slinger, he does have only one combat skill, and that is Attunement Martial. Now, Attunement Martial isn't necessarily even a combat skill, so it's interesting and unique in that way. Because he hasn't got that many combat skills, it's actually given him a bit of a broad spread in terms of other types of skills. He has 2 social skills, 2 knowledge skills.
An initiative, which is cool.
Initiative, yep. She's got 3 social skills. Looking
Well,
at
you
that.
can count cool as a social
Yeah, I
skill,
guess you
but
could,
it's
yeah.
primarily an initiative
Well,
skill.
true, yeah, you're right. It is, absolutely. So he's quite a unique character in the range of skills he's got. And because he does have attunement martial, he's only really going to be useful for a tuned human character to play.
Technically, you can take it as someone else.
You could, but you'd be kind of silly doing so because the only species or archetype which has access to that attunement martial skill is the attuned human. So if you picked a werewolf and played a spellslinger, you'd be running around doing not a lot of things.
Well, you would be, but you just wouldn't be able to use your magical items.
Exactly.
You wouldn't even have a career skill of brawl to use your claws.
Yeah, it would be a very dead
Yeah.
career, I guess, for any class, any archetype that's not a tuned human.
Yep.
But in saying that, creating a career is fairly simple. Once you know what the guideline is, like me and GM Flano, we sat down and smashed out 10 careers in
It was like an hour.
an hour.
Or less.
Exactly. And they're all fairly balanced with each other because there's no real, having to worry about XP costs or anything like that.
No, it's just choosing what fits.
Exactly.
It's definitely a flavour process.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you take a look. As long as you're not sort of overbalancing it by putting all of your career, all of the combat skills in, and I can't do anything else because that kind of just
Makes a one-dimensional character as well as overtuning them for that one thing.
That's right. So
you're not gonna have fun with that.
And honestly, creating a career, the hardest thing is trying to keep a picture of the type of career or character in mind and picking the skills which work for that. Because it's easy to deviate into other skills. I want all of this. And then realize, I've already got 12 skills. I can only have 8.
Yep.
And sometimes cutting off some of the unnecessary skills is actually quite hard to do.
Yep.
So you have to make hard decisions sometimes when creating your careers. And if you create in your campaign, If you have a good player group that you're confident who aren't going to exploit the rules, don't be afraid of letting them make their own careers.
Yeah.
Because, again, it's a matter of just picking 8 skills to be career skills.
Yep.
So as long as your players don't abuse that and chuck it all and do 8 combat skills, not that there's even 8 combat skills in the game.
No.
But
They make their own combat
they make
skill.
their own combat skills. That's it. Yeah, feel free. This is probably the most fluid part of the whole world building part of it, to be honest.
And I think that's probably why they didn't go too far into designing your own careers for that reason. Because, it's just choose 8 careers or choose 8 skills, which will end up being your career skills. But this is another reason why that it's so important to design your skills for your career. I'll try that again. This is why it's so important to choose your skills for your campaign first, because this leads directly into that.
That's very true.
Make sure you sit down and work that out first. All right.
Worth mentioning,
Yes.
again, making these careers is entirely optional. The Genesis rulebook has pre-built ones which fit 90% of campaigns.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can always use that, and don't forget, obviously, bring that up with your GM. And there's nothing wrong with saying in your setting that these careers can also be used for this particular setting, and just list those. I know that when we designed our Ghostbusters one, we did exactly that. So you'd said, these are the careers that we would suggest, but we also have these other ones as well.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, so the next part of the process is obviously talking about the gear that can be used by the characters, so that they've designed their characters and now they need to know what they're going to use to equip their characters to take on adventures.
Yeah.
So for this sort of thing, we've decided that it's a non-standard setting as far as equipment, that we will obviously have to be creating our own list of equipment.
Yes.
And we decided that muskets were going to play a part into it, as well as your usual fantasy type melee weapons and things like that. But we've also gone so we've classified that we classified that anyway as our Mage Punk Victorian era equipment, which I believe Mike is going to be working on shortly for another supplement.
I don't like you using the word shortly, Ian.
Give it some time.
No, it is something I want to work on next. I've done my sci-fi armory, so with that under my belt, I do want to do a Victorian era armory, because I feel that is something that's overlooked in a lot of games. So
and it's a great setting.
it is.
Yeah.
And
And
people,
It does have its own real distinct style. When you look at all the games that are set in those eras, they have a very different look, feel, function. Like particularly if you're going into mage punk, steampunk type of thing, your standard pistol is not always just a standard pistol and can be so much more and be so much cooler than anything else.
Well, you've got like your pirate settings, and you've got you've also got like Space 1889, that sort of thing. So
Perfect example. Play the video game called Bloodborne, which is your very, very dark, grim horror game set in a Victorian world and has lots of cool sort of weapons and bits and pieces in there.
Exactly what I was thinking of when just a pistol is sometimes more than just a pistol.
Yep. All right. So with this setting, this is where we lead into magic, because magic in this world, as we mentioned, it's gear. So it's where it's a little bit different. We're not going to bore you with all of the rules, but essentially when you make a spell, it's locked in a permanent form as a piece of equipment.
Yep. And then that is then powered by
the lightning that's been harvested and all of that. Anyone can make these items so long as they have mechanics and the arcane mechanic talent. Okay, but only attuned humans can use them. Now, the form that these items take is generally like a pistol or a skyship. All right, that's what they are. But when we look at making them, we look at the basic magic rules that are in the back of the book, and the magic implements, as they're termed. Okay, because they are going to form the template for the weapon that we create. Say if you're creating a flintlock pistol, you're going to take a magic wand as your base. So it's going to deal +3 damage on the magic action that you've selected. So your spell. So let's say it's an attack action. Okay. And then you're going to, you also get to select for free an additional effect. Let's say it's fire. Okay. So you get all of that. And then for our purposes, you also get an additional number of augment slots, which is just like attachments with other gear. And with those augment slots, you get to slot in and change from fight to fight what other additional effects are going to be slotted in. For our purposes, we'll just go with the with fire and just work out how that works, because we're creating a firearm.
Boom, boom.
But basically that's what it is. So you've got a magic wand, which is a flintlock pistol that can create that has the fire effect. Now this increases your difficulty, but you get the fire effect for free. So when you're making your attack with the magic, I believe it just starts at 1 purple, and you use augment martial.
Okay.
Not augment, sorry, attunement martial.
Sure.
That's how you. That's it. That's basically it.
So effectively, it's removing because magic isn't a thing that can be used, as Mike mentioned before. It's not something that can be used like a normal mage would use it in a typical fantasy setting. We've removed that because the magic has become fractured like the rest of the planet has. And so instead, that then has to be infused into an item, which is effectively what we're doing in this sort of circumstance. And we're using, instead of like for a template, we're having the
magical implements.
Exactly. So the wands, the staves, and whatever else.
And they can be personalized using the augment slots. Now, I know I've probably not done a great job of explaining this, and my explanations can be a little bit dry at times. But we will, as we've said before, we will make this all available, and I will go into it a bit better for everyone to view.
But as for the armory itself, and if you are playing a more regular setting where magic isn't blended into your armory, you can either just pick one of the many settings in the back of the Genesis book and use the items straight from there. If it fits your world. If you're playing a fantasy setting, just grab the items from the fantasy part of the book. And also the general gear book. In the general gear section in the book has a fair few universal pieces of equipment too, like health packs or whatever they call it, which is essentially your health potions or stim packs or whatever you want to recall it in your setting. However, if you are playing in a very unique setting like ours, you will have to go through and create your own bits and pieces. Now you can go into that as deep as you like, or you can just create a few things here and there. As Genesis goes on in existence, more and more fan stuff is being created and added to the internet.
Yep.
There's already heaps out there. Like I myself created the generic sci-fi armory, and from doing that, I created buckets of sci-fi weapons and armor and bits and pieces. So if you're fortunate enough to be playing in a sci-fi setting, you can grab that resource and chuck it straight into your setting and don't have to worry about spending hours. I can tell you for free, it definitely takes hours to make lots and lots of weapons. So look around for bits and pieces, make your life a little bit easier, grab what you can find. If there's something very specific that you can't find out there, make it up yourself. Genesis has a fairly comprehensive set of rules for creating weapons and gear and armor, so use those. You may have to tweak some costs here and there if you find your creation's a little bit weird or has some unique special abilities. That's fine. But yeah, try and, I guess the general rule is make it easy for yourself and find stuff on the internet for free and add it to your game.
Yeah. The other thing to take into consideration, like we've mentioned before about reskinning things, there's nothing wrong with grabbing a firearm and just calling it something else.
No, that's right.
And as you say, just sort of tweaking it to suit the setting. So it may not necessarily have accurate one, but it might have something else.
Or
Who knows?
Grabbing it, for example, a revolver and giving it limited one gives you a quick and dirty musket.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to do much more work than that. And that's fine. Like in our setting, we've got the magic weapons that GM Flano just discussed, but we've also got other bits and pieces which are more mundane that other non-attuned characters can use, and that in itself is going to require a little bit of customization work to develop.
Yeah, because we did discuss, because we are using attachments, we did discuss using a infuser as an attachment that gives them a little bit. It gives us that mage punk sort of level of technology.
Essentially enables non-attuned characters to hurt the shade, which is quite important considering at the moment if you're playing by default without the special equipment, a normal person really can't hurt the shade, so they need that infuser. So, which is cool. It's also worth mentioning under gear and equipment, you probably find things like vehicles and ships as well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
If you're playing in a setting that doesn't have vehicles or ships, like a low fantasy, awesome. Horse and a cart's probably the biggest thing you have to worry about, and you don't even have to stat those out most of the time. But if you're playing in a setting like ours, you will probably have to create your own ships and vehicles and ways people move around. Again, Genesis doesn't have any rules for building ships. I suspect we'll probably get something in a supplement at some time in the future. Well, that's a guess.
We'll get more examples when Terranoth comes out.
Exactly.
There is one ship which is in there. I think is it a Caravel or something like that, which is Silhouette 5 type of vessel. So you can use that, and I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying yes, it's that, but it just has flying. Because when the one thing which is really good with obviously the Genesis setting is that it is so narrative that you don't need to have your miniatures on the tabletop. You can just say that they are currently at medium range or whatever else. As long as you know that it's flying, great.
Yeah, it doesn't matter really because flying or being in the ocean is more or less the same thing in a way.
Exactly.
And in this setting, everything's going to be flying.
Yeah, exactly.
So it is just a narrative flair on top of the mechanics of whatever it is you're looking at.
And I guess it's a good thing worth mentioning as well. Unless your game is going to use lots of vehicle combat and things like that, you can probably get away without even using stats for vehicles. If you're playing in a modern world where you're playing detectives driving from point A to point B, you don't need stats for every single car. You can probably just create one broad set of stats if you really need to. But most of the time, cars and vehicles can be treated very narratively, so you don't need hard stats at all. If you're fortunate enough to be playing in a sci-fi setting, grab a Star Wars ship and rename it and reskin it and off you go.
That's right.
But if you're really, really keen, sit down, create your own vehicles and share them online.
Yeah, exactly. Because everybody's always asking after vehicles because it's the one thing that there really isn't the rules for is the vehicle design. And I know that we've been asked a couple of times if there are any rules out there. And obviously in the upcoming engineer book for Age of Rebellion, there will be rules, which they've already mentioned on their on the release notes that they've put up on the Age of Rebellion website. That's the sort of rules that they're going to go to. How that's going to look, there's a short picture of one of them, but who knows?
I suspect vehicle building rules is too much of too much of a missing thing for FFG to ignore. So it's definitely, it feels like one of those things we'll get eventually somewhere.
Yeah,
Who knows
exactly.
where that's going to be the thing.
Look, on the Order 66 podcast, they also had one of the lead developers who went through designing vehicles. And a lot of the time, it just went on feel.
Yep.
So, bringing a hard and fast rules on that, that's going to be interesting to see what they do.
Yeah, because I know I saw a question on our Facebook page, or it might not have been our Facebook page, or somewhere online regarding Genesis, and someone was asking, I can't work out the math behind building a ship because they're trying to reverse engineer the vehicles in the Genesis rulebook.
Yep.
That's because you can't reverse engineer because those have been built purely by
feel.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's nothing wrong with doing that. And the only time you have to worry about balance is if you're giving it a cost. If it's a ship, you're giving it to your PC party for no cost. Who cares?
Yeah.
So long as it's not overpowered or underpowered, fine. Just give them some stats, numbers on a piece of paper, and off you go.
That's right, because it's not as though they're going to, as soon as you give it to them, they're going to go, right, let's sell the ship.
No.
Because that's just not going to happen.
You give them a value and say, okay, you get 10% of that value.
But this is the thing. Everything that you're looking at is all based on narrative flair.
Yeah.
Right down to the settings that we used is all the characters, all the mechanics, everything that you're looking at is all just to add a little bit of extra meat to the narrative and the side of things, and that's what you have to go by.
Yep.
So it doesn't need to be, here's the hard and fast rules of how to make it. You make it based on what you want that to do in that story.
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So our final section is adversaries. Now, designing adversaries can be found on page 202 of the Genesis rulebook. And in each of the settings, they normally list anywhere between 4 to 6 of adversaries that you can typically be found in your campaign setting. But before we get into adversaries, what we're going to do is obviously look at some of the big bads which are going to populate our world, specifically the movers and shakers, because that's actually what's on the setting sheet.
Yep.
Is it asks you to go through and who are the people in power and whatever else. So even though that we're listing these under adversaries, these aren't necessarily things that you would fight. These are things which are just additional flavour for the campaign world. And people who you may or may not interact with, but are certainly the movers and shakers of the world itself. So we created 4 main characters who are the movers and shakers of the world. So we'll go through them one at a time. Caitlin, take us through the first one.
So the first one we have is Octavius Magnuson. So he is the one that we were speaking about who has control over Shade Moon and is the owner and runner of that society. And he's basically based similar off Papa Midnight from Constantine in the sense that he really has allegiances only to himself. And he's kind of like neutral ground between the two sides. So he plays off both sides off each other. So he is the one who owns and operates and runs everything that takes place on Shade Moon. He wants to achieve power, fortune, and control over the world, which he actually obtains through his connections with both the underworld in terms of the evil entities, because he is shade touched himself, the evil entities that lie below, but also by manipulating the city-states and their vying for power and resources, which he is the provider of. So he is kind of like that middleman in terms of the key supplier of lightning for all the factions and the organizations that he has influence and mastery over, those shadow portals that we were talking about as well. So he's pretty pivotal in terms of playing off both sides and, you know, having a foot in both the light and that dark side as well, and running that underworld.
He's a perfect example of a character that the bad guys and the good guys can equally interact with, which I think is very important to have in a story.
Yep. And we referred to him as Dark Lando, I think, is in the previous episode.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because he is your... As soon as you say the word Lando, you immediately have a picture of who this character is. A wealthy, affluent, charismatic dude. However, this guy's a little bit more on the corrupt side than Lando is or was. So, yeah, it's a good parallel to draw, I think.
Yeah. Martin, would you like to take us through our second character?
Yes, this is the Old Wolf King. Okay, and now he is the original werewolf from days gone past. Now, the werewolves, we didn't mention this before, but they have a bit of a longer lifespan than you would expect. And this one, who's only rivaled really by the Lord Vampire Viessa, who is his counterpart essentially in the world. And he's hidden himself away though, because when the world shattered, he was cursed to never be able to take on that human form again. Now, what that curse entails and what that's all sort of shrouded in mystery because no one can find him.
Yep.
And why he's missing is unknown, and it's basically the
Exactly.
werewolf. All the werewolves want to find him and go, "Hey, bro."
He's a giant MacGuffin himself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Everyone just assumes that he's in this fortress in the sky, though. So there's still orders coming down from what people believe to be where he is, but no one's really ever seen him, seen him around. So there's lots of rumors. But everyone's just basically going by whatever is coming down from that city state, effectively.
And I guess he is one of our story's main protagonists.
Yes.
But he's also one of the story's main mysterious characters.
Yeah.
He's always heard but never seen. So which adds an air of intrigue immediately to his character. So your PCs at the table are going to want to go, "Ooh, who's this old Wolf King, and why are we still hearing all this news and rumors about him, but yet we can't ever see him or find him."
Yeah.
So it's important to have this sort of character in your world, really to fuel the mystery and mystique of your game.
And also to allow you as the GM control and a little bit of flair, because then you can actually make it to be whatever it is you want it to be for the story that you're wanting to tell, or that the story that the players around the table during their session 0 that they wanted to have a look at as well. So it's actually a good way of having a little bit of a mystery, a mysterious character or figurehead within the story, so that you can actually have that freedom to link the players into that narrative. If you prescribe too much with what your adversaries' roles and what they want to do and their objectives, it kind of limits the freedom that the players have in controlling that as well. Plus, it's also good to have a little bit of mystery, because then if narrative happens later down and you want to flip a couple of those pips over to create an amazing event that takes place, that's a really good opportunity to use that figurehead.
And it's probably worth mentioning too right now, you might be thinking, well, okay, I need to stat these characters out.
No.
Don't stat these characters out. Have them as these powerful untouchables. As soon as you put stats to a character, what do they do?
If you stat it, they will kill it.
That's it.
If you stat it, it will bleed.
Exactly. So leave these characters as just, as I say, untouchables.
Yeah, because you can come up with those stats if needed at the time, but understand the moment you stat it, they will take it down.
If your PCs are fighting the old Wolf King, then you may want to consider those PCs as ruling the world, because they're going to be pretty powerful.
Yeah, consider what brought you to this moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that would be a pretty cool way of finishing your campaign.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Like, consider that to be your end game, if that's what you're wanting to do. Don't have, your second session and then all of a sudden they're in front of the Wolf King that, yeah, it's not going to, well, if that was the case, it shouldn't end pretty for your players.
No, exactly right.
And
They're like the Darth Vader of this type of setting.
yeah.
So our third character, Michael, would you like to take us through that?
Our third character, easily the biggest bad of them all, is Lord Vampire Viessa Casimir. Now, she is the queen of the vampires, I should say. She's the one that ruled them all well before the great cataclysm that destroyed everything. Now, she is definitely an untouchable. She lurks within the corrupted heart of our world. Her existence is sort of questionable, because is she alive, is she tangible, or is she stuck within this ethereal plane in the center of our planet? She's the source of all the evil. She is the heart of darkness. She's what all the other vampires, or the essence of the vampires, answer to. So she is definitely the big bad villain of this world. She's the big bad your characters should fear. If her name is mentioned, then bad things are probably going to follow. Now, we're talking about characters you never stat up. This is probably one you would never stat up, because she is basically, it's equivalent of you wanting to try and stat evil or the dark side in a Star Wars campaign.
It's essentially a practical impossibility for your players to meet this character. But her machinations are everywhere.
She's a great character. You can do anything with her. She's very tangible, and having a character like that in your own campaign is very powerful. a character who has so much influence all over the world. No matter where the PCs run, they cannot ultimately escape that presence. Now, this is what this character feels. This character herself, she can sort of reach into the minds of your PCs. You want to feed them plot hooks? Have one of your PCs, your tuned PC perhaps, or one of your more shade-touched PCs suddenly has visions implanted by our queen Casimir here. So there's lots of cool things you can do by having a very ethereal big bad in your world, and that may necessarily be possible in a lot of settings. Like if you're playing sci-fi, you're not going to have an ethereal big bad like Casimir in your world. But a good example is Emperor Palpatine. His reach isn't magical. His reach is infinite because he has the whole empire at his disposal.
Wherever you run,
he's probably a good parallel to Casimir. Is this person you can never touch?
Yeah,
this evil that is everywhere and that you can never run from. Very important thing to have in all your settings.
And so our fourth character is Zierra Vesh, Queen of Theresa. Now, the Queen of a city-state no longer above the Night's Edge. So it's the city-state which has basically fallen below the clouds. So it is the one that she has been displaced.
We mentioned before that there were survivors.
Yes, that is true. And she is one of the survivors. In fact, she's probably the most important survivor out of all of them.
And we all know how she got away. She used the last energy reserve on Theresa to use the teleporter to bug out.
Yeah, she's not necessarily a nice person in any way, shape or form, but Sierra's own hubris led to the downfall of the city, as we said. So the cries for help were left unanswered by the other city-states, leaving only her and a few other people as survivors. So Sierra is she's still a high-ranking refugee. She's been brought to one of the city-states, and in order to fight the vampiric shades along, and also to bring Theresa back from the brink, from below the shadows, from below the Night's Edge, to bring it back into the light, so to speak. So Zilria has close ties with Octavius, who has provided her a new home on Shade Moon, and also provides her with transport via his exclusive portal network in order for her to conduct her business with the remaining city-states to try to gain their favour to assist them to raise her fallen city from the shadows. So she's not necessarily a nice person, as I said before. So she is definitely someone that is likely to employ the PCs to be doing her bidding, working with them to work with the other cities.
Yeah, as compared to the previous two that we talked about, she's not intangible. She's very much going to be someone that the players will meet face to face, talk with, interact with.
Yep.
Similar to Octavius in that sense.
Exactly.
Like where we've got our super big monstrous bads, we've also got our very human bads as well. And even then, they could potentially be allies to the PCs depending on the alignment of the PCs and the story that you're wanting to tell as well. Because whilst, her goal of unifying all the city-states in order to fight, what's happening, she does have her ulterior motives of actually having that control and power and lifting her city-states. But it's interesting that her goal is noble, just the means in which she's going to do them is potentially not as well. So it is all based on the alignment of the story and the characters that you have created.
The type of character she is, when we're talking about the types of your NPCs or your big bads, I guess she's probably close to your damsel in distress sort of cliche. Yes, she isn't, but like she's someone who's going to approach the PCs and ask for help, as you guys mentioned just before. She can be a damsel in distress in a political scale or even a very personal, I need you to find me this relic in this dungeon somewhere sort of scale. So it's interesting. You probably, with her type of character, it's probably important to have something like her in one of your worlds just to give your PCs plot hooks.
She's a quest giver.
Well,
She is a quest giver.
She's basically, her goal can be the goal of the good side of the PCs. It could be all of that, because if she wants to bring an entire city up above the clouds and, solidify the barrier and the protective shield that is keeping the evil at the core of the earth, then there's your good PC goal as well. Friend of my, an enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. So you can really have fun in playing how the PCs interact with her and how she actually influences the world around you depending on the decisions that are made with the characters.
Like you could be a political character batting for her, going to courts and tribunals and whatnot to try and argue her case to unite the other city-states to raise the city. So you'd fight for her, not necessarily on the battlefield, but also in a very political situation too.
In a social encounter.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And you can also see the connections between why Octavius and someone like her would work together, seeing as though they're both completely different sides of the universe, completely different sides of the world that we've created. You've got the rich monarchy and then the scoundrel who's running the world, but they both want power and they're both using each other to do so. Like it's such a myriad of all these different types of connections that are taking place and relationships that people have just within 4 characters we've created.
Yep.
And they're all, as you say, they're all interlaced together on different levels.
Correct.
You have your 2, Octavius and Zaria, who work on a more mundane level. Then you have your other 2, which sort of work behind the scenes to pull the ultimate strings of the world and the happenings that are going around, which is fantastic. And that's only 4 characters. So if you sit down and create more in your world and think of the links and ties they all have together, you get some pretty cool Game of Thrones level intricacies in your politics and drama and whatnot, which is kind of cool.
The intrigue could certainly play a major part. And you've also got to look at the what the agenda is for these characters. Yeah. Because especially just going back to Zelria for a moment, we've got someone who is clearly trying to unite all of the states. But she was in charge of a city which fell because she wasn't working with anyone.
And now she's trying to beg for help.
That's right.
It's so good.
It's interesting what's motivating her to suddenly want to work. I mean, obviously she's got the need to work with everyone because of her city. But what else is playing on her mind in that regard?
You think about ultimately the other people, the other city-states, they don't want to work with her, but at the same time, they're still stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because if they don't, they also run the risk of being in her situation of turning a blind eye to everything. So it's like, well, okay, we have to help with this queen who's didn't help any of us out. If we don't scratch her back, then we're all going to die.
But look what happened. We didn't help her.
Exactly.
And now we've started to realize this barrier and shield that was protecting effectively all of us is now effectively weakened, bringing about this new event that could bring the downfall of everyone.
That's right.
So how that plays out would be interesting in itself.
So certainly, as you said, just from these 4 characters alone, you've got all of these different plot hooks that can come into play that can create these adventure hooks for your story that you can send your players off to be dealing with the Vampire Lord's minions or working together with, Zelria and her machinations as well.
And you'll also notice as well, we actually kept those type of characters directly linked with the type of factions that we saw within the world and the different types of campaigns that you can create in this setting. We spoke about in the last one, like how fantastic it was just in generally talking. We didn't just have a straight shoot 'em up type of game. We had the elements of the political intrigue. We had the elements of the nefarious underworld. We had the occult side of, the darkness and then also, the hero type of setting. So the characters in terms of the movers and shakers were the representatives of each of those different types of factions and the different types of stories you can tell.
Yep.
So if you're thinking about all the different ways that you could potentially create all these different characters, we kept it to 4 because those were the 4 key elements and story elements that we wanted to try and create within this world. So that's a good way of looking about how to actually create those movers and shakers.
Yeah. Yep. Each is its own figurehead.
So going on to adversaries very quickly. So we won't go into precisely what we've done for each of the adversaries. We'll make that available when we do our setting, our full setting document that you'll be able to download off the website. But we sort of looked at, again, in the same sort of fashion, is the minions that would be linked in with those sorts of factions.
Yeah.
So,
who are you going to be fighting?
Exactly.
Because it is an RPG if you're going to be fighting in some way, shape or form.
That's right.
And the rules for creating these are found on page 202. If you do want to go through the stats specifically, it's a pretty straightforward process.
Exactly. All right, so obviously we looked at having a couple of minions, a couple of rivals, and some nemesis that the players can obviously work with. And we wanted to, with the sort of minions that we decided, we wanted to make them very generic so that the GM can effectively just reskin them to their own desires for their own needs. So for that, we looked at the Shade Mad, which they're going to be corrupted humans or other sort of creatures that exist in the lands below.
Ones that haven't been completely taken over by the shadow, but
driven
sort of
mad.
Sort of like humans that were left behind from before.
Yep.
That's right. We also then looked at Shadekin, which are going to be the foot soldiers of the shadows. So they're going to be minor vampires or minor, humans that have been corrupted or other creatures or whatever else.
Or even just the tendrils of the darkness as well, animating in forms of they can attack and
exactly
very fluid in what they can be.
All right, so for our rivals, Michael, would you like to take us through?
Well, for our rivals, and one of my favourites is the devoured wolves. Now, these aren't wolves that have been eaten. These are wolves that have given into the madness that all wolves are on the brink of, or werewolves, are on the brink of, and that's they always hunger because they can't feed properly anymore, because they can't eat the humans anymore that they once craved, because they need to work alongside them. So werewolves, no matter who they are in this world, have to try and exist eating just regular meat, and they never fully never fully quenches their thirst, I guess you could say. They're always famished. Although some werewolves succumb to this madness and become devoured wolves. Devoured wolves roam in packs around the setting, around the world of our setting, and they either just show up in city-states or minor city-states in their own ships and devour whole populations at a time. However, when they're not eating other populations, they eat themselves. And because they can't help it, they just continuously hunger. So they fall upon each other and just pull each other from limb to limb and try to sate this hunger they have in their pits of their stomach, but they can't do it. And the longer they are hungering, the more insane they go. Yeah. And because they're eating their own self, eating their own flesh, they get a bit of mad cow disease equivalent. So their insanity only becomes even more insane. Yeah. So there's no bartering with these hungering these devoured wolves. Yeah. They're just.
I'm getting a real Reaver vibe from these ones.
me and Jim Flannel use Reavers as a perfect example.
Yeah, that's right. And what's our second rival?
And that's the Shadekin Lieutenant. Basically, they're the big bads. They're the ones who boss around the other Shadekin. They're the ones your PCs are going to have the most challenge in fighting. The Shadekin Lieutenants, or how I'd imagine them anyway, are the ones capable of speech and discussion and talk. So a PC could have a discussion for Shadekin Lieutenant. Because I could see some settings where maybe the PCs have to work together with the Shadekin for some reason, and the Shadekin send an envoy, and that's the Lieutenant. Then he could take on the shape of a noble aristocrat or some other sort of affluent person. But behind all that, he's just very much a corrupt shadow person.
To put it into Game of Thrones terms, I guess that the Shadekin, they are your undead sort of minions as such, even though that's not what they look like. But they're like your undead minions, and some of the minor White Walkers might be your Shadekin Lieutenant, that sort of thing.
All right, so then we step into to your nemesis adversaries. And one we came up with, a bit of an interesting one, because it goes against the grain of everything else we've established in this world, in the fact that it's almost its own entity, its own third party. It's not beholden to anyone. And they're the Inquisitors. Now, the Inquisitors are basically, and people aren't too sure who they are or what they are. They just come from the darkness and they roam about and do their own thing. They question, in inverted commas, whoever they please. Shadekin, Shadowkin, humans, werewolves, they don't care. They're after something and no one knows what they are.
Yeah.
Each Inquisitor works independently. They may have their own underlings working with them, but no Inquisitor really looks a lot. No one Inquisitor looks like another.
Yep.
You could have some which are your wraithy Lord of the Rings types, others who are your Black Knights clad in armor. The others could be your more traditional Van Helsing inspired Inquisitors. The list goes on. What these adversaries exist for, not just because they sound cool, they also exist to give the GM a big bad they can throw at the PCs when they're in situations where they're not expecting it, because no one expects Inquisition. So,
but yeah, they often turn up. And they take someone in the middle of the night for reasons unknown.
Exactly, you're flying along in your airship, middle of the night, all is calm, then all of a sudden the plot gets stale, so the GM decides to make an Inquisitor appear on the deck.
And they're not even Spanish.
No. Or aren't they?
Or aren't they?
One of them could be.
And Martin, what else have we got as far as Nemesi, whatever?
We've got two others.
Nemesis.
We've got two others. We've got your generic sort of sky pirate captain. Because once again, in this world, there are many skyship battles that are going to take place, but there are those that are out for their own.
Yep.
And these are your pirates. Okay, so we've got one profile here that will be the sky pirate captain to show you exactly what will take... which will show you exactly what we mean when we expect the power level of these people to be. Yep. They could be a werewolf leading a pirate crew. It could be a human in this situation.
Yep.
Anything. But this is something to give you to stat out these people.
Yep, that's right.
And their role is pretty easy. They come and they go. They strike ships or even isolated city states.
Yep. Yep.
And they could be total profiteers, or they could be working for Octavius.
Who knows?
The ultimate freelancers, essentially.
Yep.
Again, you can reskin it to however you feel you'd like to. Yeah.
And our final one is the vampiric shadows. So whereas your Shadekin lieutenants are the big bads of that sort of thing, but they're sort of only rivals. They're the intelligence in that. You've got the vampiric shadows, which are the real powers behind the throne. Well, the real powers behind everything, really, when you talk about the shadow.
Yeah, there would be our Lord Vampire's envoys and all sorts. So they come with her message and stuff like that. And ultimately, lots of cool things you can do with those.
But these ones you can kill. They're statted.
Well, the werewolf can kill.
Yes.
Your party needs a werewolf. Pro tip. In our setting.
If you want to kill them, if you're happy with just knocking them out for them to come back later, that's fine.
Yep.
And so for our last adversary, as we mentioned in the previous episode, because I wanted somebody who was a little bit nice, I decided to create griffins, which are obviously, the flying creatures that can be used in some of our city-states to go from point A to point B, because they can't use horses, so they have to use griffins. And they're just going to be rivals, and they'll just have a few little special attacks. They won't necessarily be magical or anything like that, just a nice little addition as well.
Griffins are cool because they can be used to defend the airships in like aerial dogfighting style combat. You could have a griffin riders that just jump off the side of the airships and fly down into the darkness, intercept the shades or the shadows which are trying to attack the airship. So it's a way of also injecting starfighter combat from or dogfights into your into this setting, which is kind of cool.
And if the werewolves were on top of the griffins, that would definitely be dogfighting, wouldn't it? Oh dear, I had to throw in one pun. It was my turn. Anyway, so
you punched us that time round, Ian.
Oh no. So that's basically the framework that we've used. We've used our examples on how you can go through and create your own setting. So I think that was a great discussion, guys. And as we've said, that will be available eventually at a later stage on our website, as well as we'll make a link on the Facebook page, etc. Good discussion. Anything sort of the last final thoughts on this topic?
What we've gone through, and I think you just mentioned it, Ian, we used our campaign as a source of inspiration for yourself demonstrating that even with just a few, just a loose discussion that came out of nothing in our previous roulette, using these rules found in the Genesis rulebook and using the setting sheet as well, it's helped us really narrow down, refine, and lock down certain features. It's sort of forced us to think about certain things and do certain things.
Yep.
So my advice would be, don't start with following the rules in Genesis. Create your own setting in your head, brainstorm with your friends, then transplant what you've already generated into the rules and see what comes out at the end.
Yep. So before even sort of opening the rule book, do your brainstorming session with your group of friends first to set up that setting of what it is that you want to all be playing. Like this whole discussion has come out of basically 4 words. 4 random things.
Yep.
So sit down, do that first, and then start applying the mechanics and the rules to that setting. And you're going to need to remove magic, as we have, but we've sort of created it because we still wanted magic. That was one of the things, I think that was your suggestion.
It was one of the words, yeah.
Yeah, one of the words was magic, but we wanted to do something a little bit different rather than just
subvert the trope.
Exactly. So, Martin, any further thoughts?
You don't have to go as complicated as I have with the magic and creating those systems. I mean, for me, it seems pretty simple in my head, but telling people how that actually works can be complicated. So, don't be afraid to just go with what's in the book.
Yep.
If you want to make it complicated as well, go for it.
It doesn't have to be different to be good.
Exactly. No. That's sort of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And the other thing as well is that when you're talking about magic, the way that magic appears in the rulebook, it is very abstract. So if you've got a certain setting that has a certain feel with the way that the world works, that's going to then influence the descriptions, the narrative descriptions that a player would be overlaying when they describe what their magic is actually doing. That sort of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Caitlin, any further thoughts?
I think for me, when it comes down to actually creating the mechanics and thinking about the detail behind some of these tangible items within the world, or even the characters themselves, I think the most important thing is to consider what elements you're adding that is actually going to add to the narrative. So if you're thinking about what rules you need to make, what talents you need to make, what gear you need to make, what kind of weapons are going to be there, and what kind of characters you're going to have and how they're going to be statted out, think about what that's going to look like and what that's going to feel like in the narrative and in the setting to the players. That's what's going to give you the answer about how strong a particular character should be. That's going to tell you what kind of special talents would make that particular character awesome. Or if you're looking at a vehicle, what kind of vehicle do the different types of characters need to do in different types of narrative circumstances. So having a think about, you can always just pick up another book and reskin it. But if you're really wanting to try and create that truly customizable item or object, just think about what that's going to end up being rolled on the table when it comes to your players.
Exactly. Well, yeah, thanks, guys. I think that was a fantastic discussion, and hopefully the listeners will be able to utilise what we've created to assist them or give them a few ideas of their own setting. As I said before, that we'll make sure that that's available at a later stage. We won't commit right now because there is a lot of work in relation to doing this up as a proper setting that you can use. But if you've got any ideas, by all means, send us through. If you've got an idea for a character or an NPC that we can utilise in the setting, send them through. We'd love to hear that as well. So yeah, thanks again, guys, for this discussion. Thank you very much, all listeners. And I believe that we're going to be answering some questions. Is that correct?
Nah.
I think we are. I'm judging. You can't see this because it's a podcast, and I know it doesn't translate. But Ian had GM Hooley has a very confused look. What? I thought we were actually going to be doing that. All right. Yes. I'll high five the one that you're waiting for everyone to.
We can do it, and we'll call it behind the screens.
Oh, good idea.
Yes. Behind the screens. Good.
Behind the screens.
and welcome to Behind the Screens, where we, the hosts of the show, will answer your games and rules questions regarding the Genesis role-playing game. And tonight, we're going to have one question because that last show topic was huge. And we also talked forever at the start of the show. So we're going to keep it at one question only. Martin.
All right, so we've got a question here from one of our listeners, Edward Kelly. And he asks, in my recent game, a player narratively described an action that had more flair than the rules allowed. The example was that the player was using magic to hold a person in place. They described it as pinning them to the ceiling, but rolled additional advantage, which was used to force the target to drop his weapon. The rules state that the weapon is just dropped at their feet. However, not wanting to distract from the narrative, I ruled that the NPC couldn't pick up the weapon because he was pinned to the roof, even though technically he was engaged with the weapon, and according to the rules, he could pick that up. Is this how you guys would handle it? Thanks for a great podcast.
Mike?
Well, I think it depends on how tight you are with the rules or how loose you are with the rules. The player described a fairly cool narrative thing by pinning him to the ceiling. Rules is written. Technically, the pinned NPC hasn't actually moved any distance. So the weapon is still technically dropped within engagement. So you should be able to just pick that up by doing a single maneuver. That's raw. It also comes down to how big you think the engaged range is, because engaged range isn't necessarily within,
like a foot.
It could be quite variable how big engaged is. So floor to ceiling, you could maybe quantify that as being engaged if you really wanted to, etc. So raw wise, yes, he could pick that weapon up because it is technically still engaged, even though the flair of the description has pinned him to the ceiling. However, the player could also have done a flip story point and had that guy, he has been pinned to the ceiling, short range away from his weapon now.
Yes.
That's what story points are there for, to bend the rules when they seem appropriate.
Because the key thing here as well is that you don't want to reward your player more than the rules allow or punish them further than for providing a narrative description. So, and you got to think as well, if the roles were reversed, what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Yeah, exactly.
If your player can do it, and then you can do it too. So make sure that it's something that is fair and reasonable.
Yep, exactly. Caitlin?
I was going to say story point. Because that's if you're looking at cold hard rules and you want to add a narrative flair to it, you're right. That's exactly what the story points are for. Yep. So if that was me and like the rules, everyone knows me. I'm not exactly if the story makes something cool, I will forego the rules in order to have that cool moment for players.
Yep.
But that would be, to me, perfect example of how you use a story point.
Yeah, exactly.
Good old story points.
Well, my opinion is basically that story comes first and foremost. So in that sort of case, is it close by? He's described that it's on the roof, so you just go with whatever's been ruled before. So look, if it was me, I think that I would have made it a little bit harder for the NPC because it looked cool on film. So you just can't go back on that. But as you say, that you kind of sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place because if the situation was reversed, as you mentioned before, GM Flano, that you're going to have your players basically go, but the rules say, or run the risk of that. So yeah, I don't know. I think that you just have to make a judgment call at the time. I know that sounds like a real cop-out, but I think that, the way that he handled it was probably fine.
Yeah. And I guess at the end of the day, this going back to the story points again, if you do find yourself in a situation where you're not sure how to handle it because, you don't want to punish your players for being very descriptive and epic with their actions, because that's amazing when players do that.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing more boring than a player to say, I attack with my sword. You want them to get really, flamboyant with their descriptions and whatnot. But if you're in a situation where the rules sort of butt heads with the narrative and you're not too sure where to go, flip a story point. to allow the player to make that decision, or use the GM to make the decision.
Or even if like the rules of the game conflict with the rules of reality. Like if you're looking at that, like he is on the ceiling. Like if that was me as a player, if he's on the ceiling or against the wall and he is pinned, like it's not as simple as I've just knocked it out of his hands. He's completely able to go down and pick it back up. Like reality in the world, whatever world you could be in, like there does have certain rules about how that works. It's not as simple as just going and picking it up if you're on the ceiling.
Yeah.
And the other thing to remember is there is absolutely nothing wrong with if you're at a loss for what to do, make a call.
Yep.
Don't discuss it at the table. Mm-hmm. If there is an issue, talk about it afterwards.
Yep. And I think as a player, you have to accept the GM, providing that they've done their boilerplate at the start. They're not trying to screw the players over. Yep. I think that as long as the players have accepted that social contract, and I think we spoke about this in session 0, that you just trust the GM to make that judgment call. If at the end of the session you want to have a discussion about that particular ruling, great. Or even away from the table, post-session via social media or whatever. Yep. Ultimately, let the GM make the call so that the story keeps moving.
Yeah.
Well, in this example, the GM has actually ruled in favour of the players. So,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So
well done.
Good job, you. All right.
Thanks, Ed.
All right, so I think that brings us to the end of another great show. Long, but great.
I'm exhausted.
I think that's pretty much a wrap. And until next time, I'm GM Hooley.
I am GM Huz.
I'm GM Flano.
And I'm GM Caitlin.
And together, we are the Dice Pool Podcast, where adventure is just a roll away. The Dice Pool Podcast is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Dice Pool Podcast is a fan-generated podcast. All of the information provided on the podcast and related website are not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensors. The content of this podcast remains the property of the Dice Pool Podcast and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesis role-playing game, the Genesis logo, content and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games.
Well, they're cool because they can be mounted on our airships and used for
maybe not mounted.
Oh no, bro! The Griffin's mounted our airship again. Get off it, bro! You stupid Griffin.
Griffin.